Phocas, the Byzantine nightmare. Let's start at the very top of the brutality chart, with an emperor so unpleasant that even other brutal emperors would probably ask him to calm down. Phocas ruled from 602 to 610, and in those 8 years he managed to make almost everyone wish he hadn't. Now, Phocas wasn't born into royalty. He was a centurion, a middle-ranking military officer, which is a bit like being a middle manager who suddenly becomes CEO because he staged a very violent coup. He seized power by overthrowing Emperor Maurice, and here's where things get immediately dark. Maurice had been a decent enough ruler, all things considered. Phocas didn't just kill him, he made Maurice watch as his 5 sons were executed one by one. Then, just to ensure maximum trauma, Phocas had Maurice killed too. Historians describe this as one of the most unnecessarily cruel acts in Byzantine history, which is really saying something given the competition. Once in power, Phocas developed a hobby that can only be described as enthusiastic persecution. He particularly enjoyed tormenting anyone he suspected of disloyalty, which turned out to be a lot of people. His methods included mutilation, blinding, and public executions that were designed more for terror than efficiency. The Byzantine chronicler Theophylact Simocatta wrote about Phocas with the kind of disgust usually reserved for plague rats. Phocas also had a talent for making terrible military decisions. While he was busy torturing senators and anyone who looked at him funny, the Persian Empire decided this was a great time to invade. The Persians swept through Byzantine territories, and Phocas responded with all the strategic brilliance of someone who got their position through murder rather than merit. He was too busy purging his own government to mount an effective defense. His physical appearance apparently matched his personality. Sources describe him as short with a face disfigured by scars, and a unibrow that allegedly made him look perpetually angry. Medieval chroniclers loved mentioning that he looked like a villain, because apparently even back then, people enjoyed pointing out when someone's outside matched their inside. The empire collectively sighed with relief when Heraclius, a governor from Africa, sailed to Constantinople and overthrew Phocas in 610. Phocas was executed, his body mutilated and dragged through the streets. Not a dignified end, but then again, dignity hadn't really been his thing.
Up next, we move to someone who made family dinners very awkward.
Caracalla, matricide, and mass murder. If Phocas was brutality without purpose, Caracalla was brutality with a deeply personal twist. He ruled from 211 to 217, and managed to pack an impressive amount of horror into those 6 years. Born Lucius Septimius Bassianus, he got the nickname Caracalla from a Gallic hooded cloak he liked to wear. Imagine being so famous for murder that people remember you by your fashion choices. Caracalla's greatest hit, if we can call it that, was murdering his own brother. Gaeta was his younger sibling and co-emperor, appointed by their father Septimius Severus in a desperate hope that the boys would share power nicely. They did not. The brothers hated each other with the kind of intensity that makes normal sibling rivalry look like a friendly disagreement about who gets the last cookie. They reportedly considered dividing the entire Roman Empire in half just to avoid having dinner together. Caracalla solved this problem in 217 by arranging a reconciliation meeting with Gaeta in their mother's apartments. Julia Domina, their mother, must have been so hopeful. Finally her boys were going to make peace. Instead, Caracalla had his guards rush in and stab Gaeta to death, in his mother's arms. While she watched, Julia Domina was wounded trying to protect her younger son, and the traumatic image of her holding her dying child while her other child orchestrated the murder is one of the darker moments in Roman imperial history. But Caracalla wasn't done. He then ordered the execution of anyone who mourned Gaeta. Anyone who even mentioned Gaeta's name fondly was marked for death. Historians estimate that about 20,000 people were killed in the purge that followed, including senators, soldiers, and random citizens who made the mistake of saying something nice about the wrong brother. Gaeta's name was chiseled off monuments throughout the empire. This is what historians call damateo memoria, the condemnation of memory, though in this case it came with significantly more murder than usual. Caracalla also had a famous temper, and would execute people for minor offences or perceived slights. He once massacred thousands of young men in Alexandria because he heard they'd mocked him in a play. He showed up pretending to honour them, then had his troops surround and slaughter them. Thin skin and absolute power make a truly terrible combination. Now, speaking of terrible combinations, let's talk about an emperor who thought he was a god. Caligula, madness on the throne. Caligula's the emperor everyone's heard of, even people who can't name any other Roman rulers. He reigned from 37 to 41, just 4 years, but he packed enough madness into that time to fuel 2,000 years of disturbing dinner party conversation. His real name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, but soldiers nicknamed him Caligula, meaning little boot, because he wore tiny military boots as a child. Imagine being remembered for wearing cute shoes and then becoming history's poster child for imperial insanity. He started out promising enough. When he became emperor at age 24, Romans were genuinely excited. He was the great-grandson of Augustus, son of the beloved general Germanicus, and his early months showed real potential. He gave bonuses to soldiers, recalled exiles, and stopped the treason trials that had made Tiberius's reign so unpleasant. People thought they'd gotten lucky. Then something changed. Some historians think he had a serious illness, maybe encephalitis, that damaged his brain. Others think power simply revealed what was already there. Either way, Caligula went from promising young ruler to something else entirely. He started declaring himself a living god, which wasn't entirely unusual for Roman emperors in the eastern provinces, but Caligula took it seriously. He'd have conversations with statues of Jupiter, sometimes arguing with them. He built a temple to himself and appointed priests to worship him. He allegedly tried to make his favourite horse Incitatus a consul, though historians debate whether he actually meant it or was just mocking the Senate. Either way, it's not a great sign when people can't tell if you're joking about giving your horse a government position. The executions became casual and creative. He'd order deaths during dinner parties as entertainment. He allegedly fed criminals to wild animals, not because it was necessary, but because meat was expensive and this seemed economical. He once said he wished Rome had a single neck so he could cut it all at once, which is the kind of quote that really doesn't make it into inspiring leadership books. He forced senators to run alongside his chariot for miles. He'd make elderly, dignified men in togas sprint like they were training for the Olympics, just because he found it amusing. Humiliation was as much his tool as execution. But if you think declaring yourself a god is peak megalomania, wait until you meet an emperor who actually burned the capital. Nero, fire, matricide, and musical delusions. Nero ruled from 54 to 68, and he's the emperor who proves that artistic ambitions and absolute power should never share the same person. He wanted desperately to be remembered as a great artist, a legendary musician, a theatrical genius. Instead, he's remembered for allegedly playing the lyre while Rome burned, which is history's way of saying your rebrand didn't work out. Let's start with the matricide, because that's where things get properly Shakespearean. Agrippina the Younger was Nero's mother, and she was one of those ambitious Roman mothers who makes helicopter parents look relaxed. She maneuvered and murdered her way to getting Nero on the throne, probably poisoning Emperor Claudius to make it happen. For the first few years, she essentially ruled through her teenage son, which Nero tolerated until he didn't. Nero decided to kill her, but Agrippina was suspicious and hard to poison, probably because she'd spent years poisoning other people and knew all the tricks. So Nero tried something more creative. He built a boat designed to collapse and sink, invited his mother for a pleasant cruise and hoped she'd drown. The boat collapsed right on schedule. Agrippina swam to shore. You have to admire her survival instinct, even if everything else about this family is horrifying. Finally, Nero just sent soldiers to her villa to finish the job. According to the historian Tacitus, Agrippina's last words told the assassins to strike her womb, the body that had borne such a son. Even by Roman standards, that's dark. Then there's the Great Fire of Rome in 64. The city burned for 6 days, destroying huge sections of the capital. Did Nero start it? Probably not. Did he play the fiddle while it burned? No, because fiddles hadn't been invented yet. But did he use the destruction as an opportunity to seize land and build himself an enormous golden palace called the Domus Aurea? Absolutely. When your home improvement project requires a city-destroying fire, you might be overdoing it. Nero also needed a scapegoat for the fire, so he blamed the Christians, who were a small unpopular religious sect at the time. He had them burned alive as human torches to light his garden parties. He sewed others into animal skins and have dogs tear them apart for entertainment. It was persecution as performance art, and it was hideous. Speaking of performance, let's meet an emperor who thought he was the greatest gladiator ever. Commodus, the gladiator tyrant. Commodus ruled from 180 to 192, and he's what happens when you give unlimited power to someone whose main interest is fighting animals in an arena. He was the son of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who wrote beautiful thoughts about virtue and duty. Marcus spent his evenings writing meditations about being a good person. Commodus spent his evenings in the Colosseum decapitating ostriches. Parenting is full of surprises. Commodus genuinely believed he was the reincarnation of Hercules, not in a poetic, metaphorical way. He actually thought he was Hercules in human form. He dressed in a lion skin and carried a club, wandering around the palace like he was on his way to complete the 12 labours instead of, governing an empire. He renamed Rome after himself, called it Colonia Commodiana, because subtlety wasn't really his strength. He renamed the months too, giving them names that honoured himself. January became Amazonius, after his favourite concubine. The Senate had to sit there with straight faces pretending this was all very normal. But his real passion was the arena. Commodus fought as a gladiator, which sounds brave until you realise the fights were completely rigged. His opponents used wooden swords. He used real ones. He fought wounded or drugged animals, then strutted around like he'd conquered genuine threats. He once killed 100 bears in a single day, which is less impressive when you realise they were probably tied up or already dying. He charged the Roman treasury enormous fees for these performances, essentially making the empire pay to watch him beat up defenceless creatures. The cruelty extended beyond the arena. He executed senators on whims, sometimes during gladiatorial games where he'd point at someone in the crowd and have them dragged down and killed on the spot. He once brought a man with no legs into the arena, dressed him like a giant, gave him sponges to throw instead of rocks, then clubbed him to death. The crowd was forced to applaud. Not laughing at the emperor's jokes could get you executed, which really takes the pressure off modern comedy audiences. He also had an unfortunate habit of demanding that crippled people fight each other for his amusement, treating human suffering as afternoon entertainment. The Romans tolerated a lot from their emperors, but even they eventually decided Commodus was too much. Next up, an emperor who brought religious fanaticism to terrifying new heights. Elagabalus, sacred stone and sacred terror. Elagabalus ruled from 218 to 222, and he managed to shock Rome so thoroughly in just 4 years that centuries later historians still struggle to describe him without using words like unbelievable and unprecedented. He became emperor at age 14, which already seems like a questionable decision, but the real issue was that he was a hereditary priest of the Syrian sun god Elagabal before he was emperor. He brought that enthusiasm for Eastern religious practices to Rome, and Rome was not ready. His grandmother, Julia Maessa, engineered his rise to power by claiming he was the illegitimate son of Caracalla. The army bought it, probably because they wanted to believe in a connection to the Severan dynasty, and suddenly a teenage priest was running the Roman Empire. Elagabalus brought a black meteorite stone, the sacred representation of his god, to Rome and installed it in a new temple. He made this stone the supreme deity of Rome, placed above Jupiter himself. Romans watched their traditional religious order get rearranged by a teenager who seemed more interested in Syrian ritual than Roman tradition. The sacred marriages were particularly bewildering. Elagabalus married the stone to various Roman goddesses in elaborate ceremonies that combined Syrian and Roman practices in ways that pleased no one. He married and divorced 5 women in 4 years, including a Vestal Virgin, which was such a profound violation of Roman religious law that even emperors had avoided it. Vestal virgins were supposed to remain chaste for 30 years of service. Marrying one was like casually setting fire to Rome's most sacred traditions. His personal behaviour scandalised the city. Ancient sources describe him wearing silk robes, makeup and wigs, presiding over banquets where he'd shower guests with flower petals, so deep that some guests reportedly suffocated. The petals started as whimsy and ended as accidental murder, which really summarises his reign. He allegedly married a male athlete in a public ceremony, and referred to himself as the athlete's wife, which in conservative Rome was the kind of thing that made senators quietly start planning regime change. The executions were less systematic than someone like Caracalla, but more random and bizarre. He'd kill people who displeased him during religious ceremonies or banquets, treating human life as casually as he treated Roman tradition. His unpredictability made him dangerous in a different way than the calculating tyrants. Coming up next, an emperor whose paranoia turned the palace into a prison. Domitian Paranoia perfected. Domitian ruled from 81 to 96, 15 years of increasing suspicion and tightening control. He was the younger son of Vespasian, and his older brother Titus got all the praise and popularity. Titus was beloved, charismatic, generous. Domitian watched from the shadows and learned that being liked meant nothing if you couldn't hold power. So when he finally became emperor, he decided fear would work better than affection. He started reasonably enough. He built extensively, restored buildings, even tried to enforce moral legislation that made him look like a stern but fair ruler. But underneath the competent administration was a mind that saw conspiracies everywhere, and the longer he ruled, the more those conspiracies seemed real to him. Or perhaps they became real because he made them real. When you start executing people for plotting against you, eventually people actually do start plotting against you. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy with a very high body count. The treason trials became his signature tool. Domitian revived the practice of prosecuting people for maiestas, treason, which could mean almost anything if you interpreted it creatively enough. Criticizing the emperor, treason. Consulting an astrologer about the emperor's future, treason. Writing history that portrayed dead emperors too favorably, probably treason, because it implied criticism of the current one. Senators lived in constant fear, never knowing if a casual conversation might be interpreted as conspiracy. He particularly hated philosophers and astrologers, exiling them from Rome and Italy. Philosophers asked too many questions. Astrologers predicted futures that might not include him. Both were clearly dangerous. He executed his own cousin Flavius Clemens on vague charges, along with numerous senators whose primary crimes seemed to be existing while wealthy or popular. The palace became a place of whispers and watching eyes. Domitian had the walls of the porticos where he walked covered in reflective stone so he could see anyone approaching from behind. He trusted no one, not his advisors, not his guards, not even his wife Domitia. She had good reason to fear him too, since he'd executed one of her alleged lovers and humiliated her publicly. When the conspiracy finally came, she was part of it, along with palace officials who'd realized that living in constant terror wasn't sustainable. They killed him in his bedroom in 96. The Senate immediately declared Damnatio Memoria, erasing his name from monuments with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested they'd been waiting for this moment. Next, we meet a giant who ruled through sheer intimidating size. Maximinus Thrax, the barbarian giant. Maximinus Thrax ruled from 235 to 238, and he holds a special distinction in Roman history. He was the first emperor who never set foot in Rome during his entire reign, which tells you something about his priorities. He was a soldier's emperor, risen from the ranks, allegedly the son of a Gothic father and an Allan mother from Thrace, hence the nickname Thrax. Rome had always been snobbish about bloodlines and breeding, and here was a man who represented everything the old aristocracy feared, a giant barbarian with an army behind him. And when ancient sources say giant, they really mean it. The Historia Augusta claims he was over 8 feet tall, though that's probably exaggerated. Even if we assume he was merely very tall by ancient standards, maybe 6.5 or 7 feet, he was physically intimidating in an age when average height was significantly shorter than today. Sources say he could pull a loaded wagon, break a horse's leg with a single kick, and crush stones in his bare hands. Whether all that's true or frontier legend doesn't really matter. People believed it, and belief is half of intimidation. He came to power by murdering the previous emperor Severus Alexander, along with Alexander's mother Julia Marmea. The troops were tired of being ruled by what they saw as a mother-dominated weakling, and Maximinus offered them strength and raised pay. They declared him emperor on the spot. He never bothered getting Senate approval, which was technically required. He just started ruling and dared anyone to object. His reign was essentially 3 years of military campaigns and taxation. He needed money to pay his soldiers, so he confiscated wealth from anyone who had it, particularly rich senators and landowners. The Senate hated him, naturally, And he returned the feeling. He executed senators on suspicion of disloyalty, confiscated estates, and treated the entire aristocratic class like a funding source for his wars against Germanic tribes. The cruelty was less creative than someone like Caligula, more brutally efficient. He didn't torture people for entertainment. He killed them to take their money and eliminate opposition. When rebellions broke out in Africa, he responded with overwhelming force and mass executions. When his own soldiers finally turned on him during a siege, they killed him and his son, beheaded both, and sent their heads to Rome as proof. Speaking of systematic cruelty, let's discuss an emperor who turned persecution into policy. Diocletian. Industrialized persecution. Diocletian ruled from 284 to 305, and here's the complicated thing about him. He was actually one of the most effective emperors Rome ever had. He reformed the military, restructured the economy, divided the empire into more manageable administrative units, and essentially saved Rome from the chaos of the 3rd century. He was competent, organized, and brilliant at governance. He was also responsible for the most systematic persecution of Christians in Roman history, which really shows that being good at your job and being good as a person are not the same thing. The Great Persecution began in 303 and lasted for years, varying in intensity across different parts of the empire. Diocletian issued a series of edicts that escalated from forbidding Christian worship to demanding universal sacrifice to the Roman gods or face execution. Churches were destroyed, scriptures burned, Christian property confiscated. Anyone who refused to sacrifice was subject to torture, imprisonment, or death. This wasn't random violence or personal vendetta. It was organized, bureaucratic, empire-wide policy. The methods were efficient in the worst possible way. Mass arrests, systematic torture to extract renunciations of faith, public executions designed to intimidate others into compliance. Christians were burned alive, beheaded, thrown to wild animals in arenas, or subjected to creative tortures that Roman administrators documented with the same attention to detail they used for tax collection. The eastern provinces, where Diocletian's influence was strongest, saw particularly intense persecution. Egypt and Syria experienced waves of martyrdoms that contemporary Christian sources describe in horrifying detail. What makes Diocletian particularly chilling is the contrast between his personal demeanor and his policies. He wasn't a raving madman like Caligula, or a sadist like Caracalla. He was methodical, rational, convinced he was preserving Roman tradition and unity. He saw Christianity as a threat to social order, and dealt with it the way he dealt with all threats, with organized, efficient removal. It's the banality of evil, centuries before that phrase existed. He also executed or exiled many of his own officials who converted to Christianity, including people who'd served him loyally for years. Loyalty mattered less than religious conformity. The personal betrayals added another layer of cruelty to the systematic persecution. Diocletian eventually retired in 305, one of the few Roman emperors to voluntarily give up power. He spent his final years growing cabbages in his palace at Split, reportedly happier with vegetables than he'd been with empire. But his persecution continued under others, particularly one enthusiastic successor, Galerius, torture enthusiast. Galerius ruled as co-emperor and then senior Augustus from 305 to 311, and if Diocletian designed the persecution system, Galerius was the one who truly enjoyed operating it. He was Diocletian's Caesar, his junior partner, and he took to Christian persecution with an enthusiasm that made even other persecutors uncomfortable. Diocletian was methodical, Galerius was passionate about it. Ancient Christian sources paint him as the primary instigator of the Great Persecution, the voice whispering in Diocletian's ear that Christians were a cancer that needed cutting out. Whether that's entirely fair or early Christian propaganda is debatable, but what's certain is that once Galerius had power, the persecution intensified in the territories he controlled. The eastern provinces under his direct rule saw some of the worst atrocities of the entire persecution period. His methods were deliberately designed to maximize suffering. Quick executions were too merciful. Galerius preferred tortures that lasted, that broke people slowly. Christians were roasted on heated metal beds, had their flesh scraped off with iron claws, were subjected to the rack until their joints dislocated. The goal wasn't just death, but spectacular public suffering that would terrify others into submission. He turned martyrdom into theatre. except the audience was supposed to learn fear, not admiration. One particularly grim account describes how he'd have Christians' feet burned in fire until the flesh fell away, then force them to walk on the exposed bones. Others were blinded with hot irons, had their tongues cut out, or were mutilated in ways designed to leave them alive but destroyed. The cruelty had a pedagogical purpose in his mind. Every broken body was a lesson about the consequences of defying Roman religious authority. His personal life was equally unpleasant. He was reportedly gluttonous, temperamental and violent even toward his own family. His palace was a place of fear, where servants and officials lived in terror of his rages. Unlike Diocletian, who at least maintained dignity in his personal conduct, Galerius combined policy brutality with personal nastiness. The irony is how it ended. In 311, dying from a painful rotting disease that ancient sources describe with visceral detail, Galerius issued an edict of toleration. He admitted the persecution had failed to eliminate Christianity and granted Christians the right to worship, asking them to pray for his health. It didn't help. He died shortly after, his body reportedly consumed by the same rot he'd inflicted on others. Up next, another enforcer who made Diocletian's system work through fear. Maximian, Diocletian's enforcer. Maximian ruled as co-Augustus alongside Diocletian from 286 to 305, then tried multiple comebacks that ended poorly. If Diocletian was the brains of the Tetrarchy, the four-ruler system they created, Maximian was the muscle. He was a military man from peasant origins, rough, brutal, and utterly loyal to Diocletian, at least until he wasn't. Where Diocletian reformed and reorganized, Maximian crushed and conquered. They complemented each other the way a scalpel complements a hammer. Diocletian gave him the Western Empire to rule, which turned out to be the more immediately violent assignment. Maximian spent his early years putting down rebellions with the kind of thoroughness that leaves very clear historical records. In Gaul, a peasant revolt called the Bagaudae Uprising threatened regional stability. Maximian's solution was systematic massacre. He didn't negotiate or offer reforms. He sent in legions and killed rebels by the thousands, until the countryside remembered why rebelling against Rome was generally a poor life choice. In Britain, a usurper named Caracalla had declared himself emperor and controlled the island along with northern Gaul. Maximian tried to invade, failed, then spent years building a fleet and army to try again. When he finally succeeded in retaking the territories after Caracalla was murdered by his own treasurer, Maximian's vengeance was comprehensive. Anyone suspected of supporting the breakaway regime faced execution or confiscation. He treated reconquest like punishment, making sure Britain remembered the cost of independence. The Christian persecution in the West was less intense than in the East, partly because Diocletian's control was stronger there, and partly because Maximian seemed less personally invested in religious conformity. But he still enforced the edicts, still destroyed churches, still imprisoned and executed Christians who refused to sacrifice. The difference was that Maximian's cruelty wasn't ideological, it was practical. Christians were non-compliant subjects, so they needed correcting, the same way rebellious peasants or usurpers needed correcting. It was all just problems requiring violent solutions. His personal brutality extended to his family. When his daughter Fausta married Constantine, Maximian later tried to have Constantine assassinated, using his own daughter as bait in the conspiracy. When that failed and Constantine cornered him, Maximian was forced to commit suicide in 310. Even his death was violent and undignified, strangled or hanged depending on which source you trust. Next we examine an emperor who made persecution his defining achievement. Decius, the great persecution architect. Decius ruled from 249 to 251, just 2 short years. But he managed to create a blueprint for religious persecution that would echo through Roman history. He came to power during the crisis of the 3rd century, that chaotic 50-year period when emperors rose and fell like seasonal crops. The empire was fracturing, barbarians pressed at every border, plague swept through cities, and the economy was collapsing. Decius looked at this mess and decided the real problem was that Romans weren't respecting the old gods enough. Specifically, those Christians needed to get with the program. The Decian persecution was the first organized, empire-wide attempt to eliminate Christianity through legal means. Previous persecutions had been local or sporadic. Decius made it systematic. In 250, he issued an edict requiring all citizens to perform a sacrifice to the Roman gods in front of witnesses and receive a certificate, a libellus, proving they'd complied. No certificate, no legal standing. It was religious loyalty as bureaucratic procedure, which is somehow more chilling than simple violence. Christians faced an impossible choice: sacrifice and deny their faith, or refuse and face imprisonment, torture and execution. Some complied under pressure, others bought fake certificates from sympathetic officials. Many refused and became martyrs. Decius didn't particularly care which option people chose, as long as the system worked. He wanted conformity, and he built an administrative structure to achieve it. The torture methods were designed to break well, rather than just end life. Christians were imprisoned in terrible conditions, starved, beaten, and subjected to creative torments meant to force apostasy. Some were stretched on racks, others had their flesh torn with metal hooks. The goal was renunciation first, death second. A Christian who broke and sacrificed was a better propaganda victory than a martyr who died defiant. Though Decius got plenty of martyrs anyway, including Pope Fabian, who was arrested and died in prison. The persecution created a theological crisis that outlasted Decius himself. What do you do with Christians who'd sacrificed under pressure but wanted back into the church? Were they forgivable? The debate split Christian communities for decades. Decius had inadvertently created both martyrs and a complicated question about forgiveness that the early church struggled to answer. Decius himself died fighting Goths in 251, probably killed in battle or shortly after. The gods he'd tried so hard to honour didn't save him from a violent end on a foreign battlefield. Next up, an emperor whose religious crusades turned brother against brother. Valens, religious bloodshed specialist. Valens ruled the eastern half of the Roman Empire from 364 to 378, and he turned theological disagreement into a blood sport. By this point in Roman history, Christianity was the dominant religion, but Christians couldn't agree on the nature of Christ. Was he the same substance as God the Father, or similar substance? It sounds like the kind of question philosophy students debate over coffee, but in the 4th century people killed each other over it. Valens picked a side, Arianism, and decided everyone else needed to agree or suffer. The Arian controversy split the Christian world. The Council of Nicaea in 325 had declared that Father and Son were of the same substance, homoousios in Greek. Arians argued for homoousios, similar substance, one letter different, oceans of blood spilled. Valens was a committed Arian, and he used imperial power to enforce his theological position with remarkable brutality. He exiled bishops who disagreed with him, confiscated churches and imprisoned clergy who preached Nicene Christianity, but he went further than administrative punishment. Valens authorized violence against Christian communities that held the wrong interpretation. In 371, he ordered the governor of Phrygia to deal with a group of Nicene Christians who'd fortified themselves in a church. The governor's solution was to set the church on fire with 80 people inside, including women and children. They burned alive for believing in homoousios instead of homoousios. This wasn't an isolated incident. Valens of officials carried out similar attacks across the Eastern Empire. Monks were beaten, priests tortured, congregations scattered. The cruelty was particularly bitter because it was Christian on Christian violence, believers persecuting believers over theological nuance. It proved that giving Christianity imperial backing didn't end religious violence, it just changed the targets. Valens also dealt harshly with pagans who still practiced the old religions, though with less systematic fervour than he showed toward Nicene Christians. Magic and divination were prosecuted vigorously, often with accusations serving as pretexts for eliminating political enemies. The trials resulted in executions, exiles, and a general atmosphere of suspicion where religious deviation of any kind could prove fatal. His military campaigns against the Goths were equally brutal when he could manage victories. But in 378, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Goths destroyed his army. Valens himself was killed, either in battle or shortly after. According to one account, he was wounded and took refuge in a farmhouse that the Goths then burned, not knowing the emperor was inside. Now let's meet another emperor who weaponized religious difference, Constantius II. The heretic hunter, Constantius II ruled from 337 to 361, first sharing power with his brothers and then alone after they conveniently died. He was the son of Constantine the Great, the emperor who'd legalized Christianity and supposedly converted on his deathbed. Constantine left the empire to his 3 sons, expecting them to rule together in brotherly harmony. Instead, Constantius survived while his brothers didn't, under circumstances that remain suspiciously murky. Family reunions must have been tense, at least until there was no family left to reunite. But Constantius' real passion was theological control. Like Valens after him, he favoured Arianism and decided that the entire Christian church needed to agree with his interpretation. The difference was that Constantius had longer to work with and more systematic methods. He convened church councils, manipulated bishops, exiled dissenters, and generally turned theology into imperial policy enforced with threats and violence. The exiling of bishops became almost routine under his reign. Athanasius of Alexandria, the champion of Nicene Christianity, was exiled 5 times. Constantius kept banishing him. Athanasius kept coming back, and the theological argument continued with increasing bitterness. But Athanasius was famous enough to survive. Lesser-known bishops and priests who opposed Arianism faced worse. Some were imprisoned, beaten, or killed by mobs, encouraged by imperial officials who looked the other way. In 356, Constantius sent troops into the church of the Theotokos in Constantinople to arrest the Nicene bishop. The soldiers burst in during a service, terrifying the congregation and dragging the bishop away. Similar scenes played out across the Eastern Empire. Churches became battlegrounds, with imperial soldiers enforcing theological conformity at sword point. Christianity had gone from persecuted sect to state religion to instrument of persecution remarkably quickly. Constantius also dealt brutally with usurpers and anyone suspected of disloyalty. His paranoia grew as his reign continued, and treason trials became common. The Comes Re Private, the Count of the Private Estate, became an instrument of terror, investigating conspiracies real and imagined. Executions and confiscations followed, enriching the imperial treasury while spreading fear through the aristocracy. His military campaigns against the Persians and Germanic tribes were marked by the standard Roman brutality of conquest, but his real energy went into controlling the church. He died in 361 while marching to confront his cousin Julian, who'd been declared emperor by his troops. Julian succeeded him, and promptly abandoned Christianity altogether. Up next, an emperor who combined military efficiency with casual massacre. Septimius Severus, massacres, and military favoritism. Septimius Severus ruled from 193 to 211, 18 years of military expansion and systematic brutality. He came to power through civil war, which was becoming something of a Roman tradition by the late 2nd century. 4 emperors in 1 year, the year of the 5 emperors they called it, and Severus emerged victorious by being more ruthless than his competitors. His advice to his sons on his deathbed was reportedly simple: enrich the soldiers, ignore everyone else. It's not exactly inspiring leadership philosophy, but it was honest. The civil wars that brought him to power left bodies across the empire. When he defeated his rival Pescennius Niger in 194, Severus didn't just win the battle, he systematically purged Niger's supporters, executing senators and confiscating estates. Entire cities that had backed the wrong side faced collective punishment. Antioch lost its status as a city and was subordinated to its rival Laodicea. Byzantium was besieged, captured, and had its walls torn down. Severus wanted everyone to remember that choosing the losing side in a civil war had permanent consequences. But his most notorious act was the sack of Lugduam, modern Lyon, in 197. The city had supported another rival, Clodius Albinus, and when Severus defeated Albinus in battle nearby, he unleashed his troops on Lugduam. The city was plundered and burned. Citizens were massacred regardless of their actual involvement in the rebellion. It was collective punishment on a massive scale, a demonstration that entire populations could be held responsible for their leaders' choices. His campaigns in Scotland showed similar thoroughness. When the Caledonians resisted Roman advance, Severus responded with scorched earth tactics. His orders were to kill everyone they encountered, man, woman, or child. He quoted Homer to justify it, saying, "Let no one escape destruction at our hands." Using classical literature to justify genocide is very on brand for Roman emperors. Severus also transformed the Praetorian Guard, disbanding the old units and recruiting new guards from his loyal legions. He essentially militarized the imperial court, surrounding himself with soldiers rather than senators. The Senate hated him, naturally, but the Senate couldn't do much when the emperor had packed Rome with troops who owed their positions to him personally. He died in 211 at York, in Britain, still campaigning at age 65. His body was cremated and his ashes returned to Rome. His sons inherited the empire and immediately started competing to see who could be worse. Speaking of those sons, let's revisit one in more detail. Aurelian, restorer through ruthlessness. Aurelian ruled from 270 to 275, just 5 years, but he crammed an entire empire's worth of violence into that brief period. He came to power during the absolute lowest point of the crisis of the 3rd century, when the Roman Empire had fractured into 3 pieces. There was the Central Empire, the breakaway Gallic Empire in the west, and the Palmyrene Empire in the east. Aurelian looked at this situation and decided the solution was to personally kill everyone until the empire was whole again, and somehow it worked. His nickname was Hand on Sword, Manu ad Ferrum, which tells you everything about his leadership style. He didn't negotiate, he didn't compromise. He showed up with legions and made reunification a non-optional proposal. The Gallic Empire fell first. Aurelian defeated their forces, and when cities resisted, he made examples of them. Resistance meant destruction. Cooperation meant you only lost your independence, which by comparison seemed generous. The Palmyrene Empire was trickier because it was ruled by Queen Zenobia, one of the most capable rulers of the 3rd century. She'd carved out an Eastern empire while Rome was distracted, and she wasn't interested in giving it back. Aurelian besieged Palmyra, captured Zenobia, and then made a decision that showed his practical cruelty. He spared the city initially, leaving a garrison. Then the city rebelled and killed his governor. Aurelian came back, and this time he didn't show mercy. Palmyra was sacked, its population massacred or enslaved, and the magnificent desert city was left in ruins. He'd given them one chance. That was more than most got. He even sacked Rome's mint workers when they revolted against his currency reforms. The mint workers. He killed people who made coins because they objected to his economic policy. The revolt was put down with typical Aurelian efficiency, meaning lots of executions and no quarter given. He was restoring the empire, and anyone who got in the way of restoration became a cautionary tale. His military discipline was legendary and brutal. Soldiers who broke ranks or showed cowardice were executed. Deserters were hunted down. He maintained order through fear and the absolute certainty that Aurelian's punishments were swift and final. It made his armies terrifyingly effective, but also meant serving under him was its own form of calculated risk. He built the Aurelian walls around Rome, admitting that the capital needed fortification for the first time in centuries. Then he set off on another campaign and was murdered by his own officers in 275. Next, we look at an emperor whose brief reign left deep scars. Severus Alexander, more brutal than remembered. Severus Alexander ruled from 222 to 235, and history has been surprisingly kind to him, probably because he came between the chaos of Elagabalus and the brutality of Maximinus Thrax. By comparison, he looks almost reasonable, but reasonable is relative, and Alexander's 13-year reign had more blood than his gentle reputation suggests. He became emperor at age 13, which meant his mother, Julia Mamaea, actually ran things, and Julia Mamaea did not become the power behind an imperial throne by being nice. The transition from Elagabalus was violent. Elagabalus and his mother were murdered by the Praetorian Guard, their bodies dragged through Rome and thrown into the Tiber. Alexander was there. He watched his cousin die to make room for him. That's the kind of lesson that stays with you. He was declared emperor immediately, covered in his predecessor's blood, literally and politically. Julia Mamaea controlled access to her son and ran the empire through him. She was ruthless about eliminating rivals or anyone who might influence Alexander away from her control. When Alexander married Salustia Barbia Orbiana, Julia Mamaea saw a threat, Orbiana's father was executed on trumped-up charges of conspiracy, and Orbiana herself was divorced and exiled. Julia Mamaea wasn't sharing her son with anyone, and the message was clear: get between mother and emperor, face destruction. The military campaigns under Alexander were marked by standard Roman brutality. The war against Persia involved the usual sacking of cities, enslavement of populations, and scorched earth tactics when retreat became necessary. Germanic tribes along the Rhine faced similar treatment when they raided Roman territory. Alexander's reputation as a weak, mother-dominated emperor comes partly from the fact that these campaigns weren't spectacularly successful, not from any actual restraint in conduct. The persecution of religious minorities continued under his reign, though less systematically than under some emperors. Christians had periods of relative peace, but local persecutions still occurred, and Alexander's government didn't stop them. Jews faced periodic violence and restrictions. The empire's machinery of oppression kept running even if the emperor wasn't personally enthusiastic about it. His end was appropriately violent. In 235, his own troops murdered him and his mother during a campaign against Germanic tribes. The soldiers were tired of Julia Mamaea's control, tired of what they saw as weakness, and tired of insufficient pay. They declared Maximinus Thrax emperor on the spot. Now let's examine an emperor whose capture became legendary humiliation. Valerian harsh before capture. Valerian ruled from 253 to 260, and his reign is remembered primarily for its spectacularly humiliating end. He became the first Roman emperor captured alive by a foreign enemy, taken prisoner by the Persian king Shapur I, and spending his final years in captivity. It's such a dramatic conclusion that it overshadows what he actually did while he had power, and what he did was persecute Christians with renewed enthusiasm and govern with the casual brutality expected of 3rd century emperors. Before we get to his embarrassing finale, let's talk about the Valerian persecution. In 257, he issued edicts targeting Christians with more focus than Decius had managed. Christian clergy were ordered to sacrifice to Roman gods or face execution. Christian senators and equestrians lost their ranks and property if they refused to renounce their faith. Christians in imperial service were enslaved. It was systematic, economically motivated, and designed to break the Christian community's organizational structure by removing its leadership and wealth. The executions were public and meant to intimidate. Bishop Cyprian of Carthage was beheaded in 258. Pope Sixtus II was executed along with his deacons in Rome. Across the empire, Christian leaders faced the choice between apostasy and death, and many chose martyrdom. Valerian wasn't motivated by religious fervour like some emperors. He needed scapegoats for the empire's problems and money to fund his military campaigns. Christians provided both. His military approach showed similar ruthlessness. He campaigned against Germanic tribes, Goths and Persians with standard scorched earth tactics when necessary. Cities that resisted faced siege and sack. Populations that supported enemies were punished collectively. He was trying to hold together an empire that was actively fracturing, and subtlety wasn't in his toolkit. Then came 260 and the catastrophic Battle of Edessa. Valerian was campaigning against Persia with a large army when Shapur I defeated and captured him. The exact circumstances remain unclear. Some sources suggest treachery or a failed negotiation. What's certain is that Valerian spent the rest of his life as a Persian prisoner. Shapur allegedly used him as a human footstool when mounting his horse. When Valerian died, supposedly Shapur had him flayed and his skin stuffed with straw and displayed as a trophy. Whether all those details are true or Persian propaganda doesn't really matter. The humiliation was real. A Roman emperor had been captured, and the empire had no mechanism for getting him back. His son Gallienus continued ruling and never mounted a rescue attempt. Speaking of Gallienus, he deserves his own examination. Gallienus, chaotic cruelty. Gallienus ruled from 253 to 268. First alongside his father Valerian, and then alone after dear old dad was captured by Persians and turned into furniture. 15 years on the throne during the absolute worst of the crisis of the 3rd century, and Gallienus responded to the empire's collapse with a fascinating combination of cultural sophistication and violent chaos. He loved Greek philosophy and the arts. He also crucified people with remarkable frequency. Renaissance man meets 3rd century warlord. When Valerian was captured in 260, Gallienus didn't organise a rescue mission. He didn't negotiate for his father's return. He just kept ruling and pretended the embarrassment hadn't happened. It was pragmatic but cold in a way that tells you something about imperial family dynamics. Your father is a Persian footstool. You shrug and move on. At least he stopped his father's Christian persecution, issuing an edict of toleration in 260 or 261. Christians probably appreciated not being executed, even if the motive was more about having other problems to worry about than actual tolerance. The empire fractured on his watch. The Gallic Empire broke away in the west. The Palmyrene Empire rose in the east. Usurpers declared themselves emperor in various provinces with exhausting regularity. Gallienus spent his entire reign fighting rebels, barbarian invasions, and anyone who thought they could do a better job. His response to rebellion was comprehensive violence. Defeated usurpers weren't just executed, their families were killed, their supporters purged, their cities punished. When Injanuarus rebelled in 258, Gallienus defeated him and then systematically destroyed everyone associated with the uprising. He was particularly brutal to military officers who failed him. Commanders who lost battles faced execution, not retirement. Soldiers who broke ranks were decimated, the old Roman punishment where 1 in every 10 men was killed by his companions. Gallienus maintained discipline through terror, which worked until it didn't. His own officers eventually conspired to murder him, probably because they'd calculated they were dead either way, and at least conspiracy offered a chance. The Gothic invasions during his reign saw thousands of Romans killed or enslaved, and Gallienus's responses were reactive rather than strategic. He'd show up, fight a battle, declare victory, and leave before the next invasion. The Goths sacked Athens in 267 while Gallienus was busy elsewhere. The empire was burning in multiple places, and he only had so many legions. His officers killed him in 268 during a siege. The conspiracy was so widespread that afterward, no one was entirely sure who'd struck the fatal blow. Next, an emperor whose paranoia created its own reality. Macronil's paranoid purger. Macrinus ruled from 217 to 218, barely a year, but he packed a remarkable amount of suspicious behaviour and preemptive violence into those 14 months. He was the first emperor who'd never been a senator, rising from equestrian rank through military administration. He was essentially middle management who murdered his way to the top job, which meant he spent his entire brief reign waiting for someone to do the same to him. Turns out that when you set a precedent for assassination-based promotion, everyone watches you very carefully. He came to power by orchestrating the murder of Caracalla, though he was careful to make it look like the act of a random soldier with a personal grudge. Caracalla was urinating on the side of the road during a campaign, when a guard stabbed him. Convenient timing, and Macrinus just happened to be nearby and ready to take control. The soldiers proclaimed him emperor, probably because they were tired of Caracalla's expensive wars and random executions. Meet the new boss, marginally less terrifying than the old boss. But Macrinus immediately faced the problem that he'd killed a member of the Severan dynasty, and that dynasty still had living relatives who commanded loyalty. Julia Domna, Caracalla's mother, was still alive and influential. Julia Matha, her sister, had money and connections. These women had survived decades of imperial politics and weren't about to let an upstart administrator keep the throne. Macrinus responded with arrests and executions of anyone suspected of supporting Severan restoration. The paranoia was justified, which made it worse. They really were plotting against him. His treatment of defeated rivals showed no mercy. When rebellions sprouted, and they did constantly, Macrinus had the leaders executed along with their families and supporters. He confiscated property liberally, both to fund his campaigns and to eliminate potential opposition. Every wealthy person was a potential threat, every general a possible usurper. He trusted no one, because no one had reason to be loyal to an emperor who'd murdered his way to power and might not survive the week. The soldiers grew to hate him because he tried to reduce their pay and benefits, attempting to undo Caracalla's expensive generosity. Soldiers with reduced income and an emperor they didn't respect made for obvious problems. When Julia Maesa declared her grandson Elagabalus emperor in 218, claiming he was Caracalla's illegitimate son, the troops switched sides with remarkable speed. Maximinus fled, was captured and executed. His son, co-emperor Domitian, was also hunted down and killed. No loose ends, no second chances. Up next, two emperors who shared power and mutual hatred. Pupienus and Balbinus. The doomed duo, Pupienus and Balbinus, ruled together for 99 days in 238, which might be the fastest proof in history that forcing two people who hate each other to share absolute power is a terrible idea. The Senate appointed them as co-emperors during the chaos following Maximinus Thrax's death, and from day one they couldn't stand each other. Pupienus was a military man who'd risen through the ranks. Balbinus was an aristocrat with impeccable lineage and patrician disdain for anyone without it. Put them in the same palace and tell them to cooperate. What could go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. They refused to live in the same building, splitting the imperial palace between them and conducting separate courts. They had separate Praetorian Guard units. Because neither trusted the other's guards, they held separate meetings with advisors. They were co-emperors in name only, really just two men occupying the throne simultaneously, while glaring at each other across the palace grounds. Roman government by hostile roommate arrangement. Pupienus at least tried to be an effective emperor. He led troops against Maximinus Thrax's remaining supporters, and showed the kind of military competence you'd expect from someone who'd actually commanded legions. When he dealt with rebels or threats to order, he was efficient and brutal in the standard Roman military way. Executions, confiscations, displays of force meant to intimidate. Nothing creative, just professional violence. Balbinus stayed in Rome and accomplished very little, except worrying that Pupienus was going to use his military success to seize sole power, which was a reasonable concern, honestly, because that's how Roman politics worked. Military success plus loyal troops usually equaled sole emperor, with the previous co-emperor experiencing sudden retirement via stabbing. Balbinus spent his 3 months being anxious and aristocratic, which is not a strong foundation for imperial authority. The Praetorian Guard, watching these two men fail to cooperate or show any actual leadership, decided the situation was untenable. They burst into the palace, found both emperors, and murdered them, together finally united in being killed. According to sources, they were dragged through the streets, beaten, stabbed, and their bodies left in the road. The Senate's experiment in dual rule lasted 99 days and ended with exactly the kind of violence everyone should have predicted. The Guard then declared Gordian III emperor, a teenager who they figured would be easier to control than two bickering old men. Speaking of emperors who were easier to control, let's discuss that teenager, Gordian III. Young but not innocent. Gordian III ruled from 238 to 244, becoming emperor at age 13 and dying at age 19 under circumstances that remain conveniently mysterious. He was the grandson of Gordian I, who'd briefly been emperor during the chaotic year of the Six Emperors, and the nephew of Gordian II, who'd lasted even less time. Being from a family of short-lived emperors didn't bode well, but the Senate and Praetorian Guard decided a malleable teenager was better than another pair of bickering adults. As with most child emperors, the real power lay elsewhere. Initially, his mother and various senators pulled strings. Then Decius became Praetorian prefect and took control, conveniently marrying his daughter to the young emperor to cement the relationship. Decius was capable, and actually governed competently, which meant the empire functioned despite having a teenager nominally in charge. But capable advisors make decisions in the emperor's name, and those decisions included the standard brutality of the era. The Persian campaign under Decius showed typical Roman military conduct. Cities that resisted were besieged and sacked. Populations faced enslavement or massacre, depending on how much trouble they'd caused. The Roman army didn't distinguish between combatants and civilians with any consistency. You lived in a city that fought back, you suffered the consequences. Gordian was there, technically in command, learning that empire maintenance required regular applications of overwhelming force. When Decius died in 243, possibly from disease or possibly from something more suspicious, Philip the Arab became Praetorian prefect. Philip looked at the situation, saw a teenage emperor with no strong power base and calculated his odds. A year later, Gordian III was dead. The official story says he died in battle against the Persians. Other sources suggest Philip had him murdered, or that the troops killed him at Philip's encouragement, or that he died from wounds after a battle that Philip had deliberately mismanaged. The truth probably died with Gordian, but the pattern is familiar. Young emperor, ambitious advisor, convenient death. Advisor becomes new emperor. It's the Roman political process streamlined to its most efficient form. Gordian's brief reign saw him presiding over campaigns, endorsing executions, and putting the imperial seal on decisions that killed thousands. Whether he actively chose any of it or just signed what was put in front of him doesn't really matter to the people who died. Next, we examine the man who probably killed him. Philip the Arab. Standard imperial violence. Philip the Arab ruled from 244 to 249, and his nickname comes from his origins in the Arabian province, modern Syria. He rose through military ranks, became Praetorian prefect under Gordian III, and then became emperor after Gordian conveniently died on campaign. Whether Philip orchestrated that death or simply benefited from fortunate timing depends on which ancient source you trust, and ancient sources loved a good murder conspiracy. Either way, Philip smoothly transitioned from ambitious subordinate to emperor, and the army went along with it because they usually did. His reign was marked by the exhausting maintenance work of holding together a 3rd century empire. Barbarian invasions, usurpers, economic problems, the usual list of catastrophes that emperors of this era dealt with through military force and harsh financial policies. Philip needed money constantly for the army, for defences, for buying off threats that couldn't be fought immediately. That money came from taxation that crushed provinces and confiscations from anyone wealthy enough to have something worth taking. The military campaigns followed standard Roman patterns. When tribes raided across the Danube, Philip sent legions to punish them. Punish in this context meant burning villages, killing warriors, enslaving populations, and creating buffer zones of devastation so the tribes would think twice about raiding again. It was preventive brutality, the Roman solution to border security. Make the cost of attacking Rome so high that most groups decided peaceful trade was less painful. Usurpers appeared regularly because the empire was too large and chaotic for any emperor to control completely. Philip dealt with them through military defeat followed by executions and purges. When you declared yourself emperor and lost, you didn't get a participation trophy, you got your head removed and displayed as a warning. Your supporters faced similar treatment. Rebellion wasn't a political disagreement, it was treason, and treason had one punishment. His treatment of Christians was relatively mild, which means he didn't actively persecute them empire-wide, just allowed local authorities to continue their own smaller-scale persecutions. Some Christian sources even claimed Philip was secretly Christian himself, though that's probably wishful thinking. More likely he was too busy with invasions and usurpers to care much about religious minorities. Neglect as tolerance, the 3rd century version. Philip celebrated Rome's 1000th anniversary in 248 with spectacular games, spending enormous amounts on entertainments while the empire frayed at its edges. A year later, Decius rebelled, defeated Philip's forces, and Philip died in battle. His young son and co-emperor Philip II was murdered by the Praetorian Guard shortly after. Now we step back in time to examine a much earlier emperor, Tiberius Capri's dark secrets. Tiberius ruled from 14 to 37, 23 years that started with competent administration and ended with paranoid isolation on an island. He was Augustus's stepson and reluctant heir, chosen after everyone else in the imperial family conveniently died. Tiberius didn't particularly want to be emperor, which maybe should have been the first warning sign. When someone doesn't want absolute power, there's usually a reason, and in Tiberius's case, the reason was that he knew what it would do to him. His early reign was actually quite capable. He governed efficiently, maintained the military, respected the Senate's dignity, at least publicly. He was cautious, experienced, and boring in the way that stable government often is. Rome functioned, the provinces were well administered. It was all very responsible. Then things started to curdle. The problem was Sejanus, the Praetorian prefect who became Tiberius's closest advisor and essentially co-ruler. Sejanus was ambitious in the way that makes Roman history so consistently bloody. He wanted power, and he understood that the best way to get it was to isolate the emperor and make himself indispensable. He encouraged Tiberius to leave Rome and retire to Capri, which Tiberius did in 26. From that point on, Tiberius ruled the empire from an island, while Sejanus controlled access to him and ran things in Rome. The treason trials intensified. Sejanus used Maesta's laws to eliminate rivals and anyone who might threaten his position. Senators were accused, tried, and executed. Their property was confiscated. The atmosphere in Rome became poisonous with suspicion. Tiberius, isolated on Capri, heard about threats through Sejanus and approved harsh measures, never quite realizing he was hearing a carefully curated version of reality designed to consolidate Sejanus's power. Then Tiberius discovered Sejanus was plotting against him, possibly planning to seize the throne for himself. In 31, Tiberius had Sejanus arrested and executed, along with his family and supporters. Sejanus's children were killed. His supporters were hunted down. The purge was comprehensive and brutal. But it didn't end the paranoia. Tiberius just continued the treason trials himself, now suspicious of everyone because if Sejanus had betrayed him, anyone might. The sources, particularly Suetonius and Tacitus, claim Tiberius's final years on Capri involved all sorts of depraved behavior, sexual perversions, cruelty, violence against slaves and visitors. Some of this is probably true, some probably exaggeration by historians who hated him. What's certain is that he became increasingly isolated, paranoid and brutal in his final years. Coming up, an emperor who combined culture with sudden violence. Hadrian, cultured but capable of carnage. Hadrian ruled from 117 to 138, 21 years of extensive building projects, cultural patronage, and occasional explosive violence that reminded everyone that sophisticated emperors were still emperors. He loved Greek culture, wrote poetry, designed architecture, and had a famous relationship with a young man named Antoninus, whose death sent him into elaborate mourning. He also crushed rebellions with the kind of thoroughness that left provinces devastated for generations. Renaissance man meets imperial enforcer. His early reign was marked by executions that set an uncomfortable tone. 4 senior senators who'd been close to his predecessor Trajan were executed on charges of conspiracy. Hadrian claimed he hadn't ordered it, that his Praetorian prefect acted independently. Maybe that was true. Maybe Hadrian was establishing deniability while eliminating potential rivals. Either way, 4 prominent men died, and Hadrian benefited from their removal. The Senate never quite trusted him after that. The Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea from 132 to 136 showed Hadrian at his most ruthlessly efficient. The Jewish population rebelled against Roman rule and Roman attempts to build a pagan city on the ruins of Jerusalem. Hadrian's response was systematic destruction. He sent his best general, Julius Severus, with substantial legions, and the resulting campaign was less battle and more methodical extermination. The Romans besieged fortified positions, starved out defenders, and killed or enslaved survivors. Sources claim that 580,000 Jews were killed, though that number might be exaggerated. What's certain is that Judea was left devastated. Villages were destroyed, the population decimated, and Jews were banned from Jerusalem. Hadrian renamed the province Syria Palestina, literally trying to erase Jewish connection to the land through administrative renaming. It was cultural erasure backed by legionary violence. His building projects, magnificent as they were, often involved forced relocations and confiscations. The construction of Hadrian's Wall in Britain required moving populations and militarizing the entire northern frontier. His villa at Tivoli, a massive complex of buildings and gardens, consumed enormous resources while provinces struggled with taxation. He could be personally cruel when offended. He allegedly blinded a slave with a pen for making a mistake, then later felt guilty and offered the slave anything he wanted as compensation. The slave asked for his eyesight back, which Hadrian obviously couldn't provide. Remorse doesn't undo violence, a lesson Hadrian apparently learned too late. His final years were painful. He suffered from a chronic illness, probably heart disease, and reportedly tried to commit suicide multiple times. His doctors refused to assist, so he lingered in pain until 138. Next, another emperor who balanced philosophy with warfare. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher who waged war. Marcus Aurelius ruled from 161 to 180, 19 years of Stoic philosophy and near constant warfare. He's remembered as the philosopher-emperor, the man who wrote meditations while on military campaigns reflecting on virtue and the nature of a good life. He's quoted in self-help books and management seminars. He's also the emperor who spent most of his reign fighting wars along the Danube, suppressing rebellions and presiding over persecutions. Wisdom and violence aren't mutually exclusive, turns out. He shared power initially with Lucius Verus, his adoptive brother, in a co-emperor arrangement that actually worked reasonably well, mostly because Verus was content to let Marcus handle the boring administrative work while he enjoyed the perks of being emperor. When Verus died in 169, possibly from plague, Marcus continued alone. The Antonine plague, probably smallpox or measles, swept through the empire during his reign, killing millions. Marcus's response was competent but not compassionate. The empire had to function, plague or not, so provinces still paid taxes and legions still marched, spreading disease along trade routes and military roads. The Marcomannic Wars consumed most of his reign. Germanic tribes crossed the Danube in massive numbers, raiding deep into Roman territory. Marcus spent years campaigning along the frontier, fighting, negotiating, and establishing new defensive positions. The warfare was brutal and exhausting. Villages burned, populations fled or were enslaved, and soldiers died in cold camps far from Rome. Marcus wrote his philosophical reflections between campaigns, finding meaning in stoic acceptance while ordering attacks on tribal settlements. The persecution of Christians intensified in various provinces during his reign, though it's unclear how much was direct imperial policy versus local enforcement of existing laws. The martyrdoms of Polycarp, Justin Martyr, and the Christians of Lyon all occurred under Marcus Aurelius. He didn't order empire-wide persecution like later emperors, but he didn't stop local authorities from torturing and executing Christians either. His philosophical tolerance apparently had limits when it came to religious deviation. His greatest personal failure was his son. Commodus was his biological heir, and Marcus broke the pattern of adoptive succession that had given Rome the 5 good emperors. Perhaps he believed blood lineage mattered, or perhaps he loved his son too much to see his flaws clearly. Either way, he left the empire to Commodus, who would prove to be one of the worst emperors Rome ever endured. Marcus died in 180, probably from plague, at a military camp near Vienna. His philosophical legacy survived. So did the consequences of his son. Next, that son who turned gladiatorial fantasy into imperial policy. Lucius Verus, Marcus Aurelius's problematic partner. Lucius Verus ruled as co-emperor alongside Marcus Aurelius from 161 to 169, 8 years of being the less philosophical, more hedonistic half of a dual reign. He was Marcus's adoptive brother, both of them chosen by Emperor Antoninus Pius to succeed him, and the arrangement worked mostly because Verus was happy to let Marcus do the actual governing while he enjoyed being emperor without the tedious parts. Think of him as the vice president who shows up to ribbon cuttings but skips the budget meetings. When the Parthian War broke out in 161, Verus was sent east to command the campaign, which sounds impressive until you realise he brought along a team of competent generals who did the actual commanding, while Verus enjoyed the eastern provinces. The war itself was brutal in the standard Roman way. Cities that resisted were besieged, captured and sacked. Artaxata in Armenia was burned to the ground. Seleucia on the Tigris, a major city, was plundered so thoroughly that it never fully recovered. The soldiers looted temples, enslaved populations, and generally demonstrated why being on the losing side of a Roman war was a terrible experience. Verus presided over all this from comfortable headquarters, occasionally making ceremonial appearances, but mostly leaving strategy to his generals. The Roman army's behaviour in Mesopotamia followed established patterns of conquest. Destroy resistance, terrorize populations into submission, take everything valuable, leave devastation as a warning. Verus got credit for victories he didn't really direct, but that was how Roman politics worked. The emperor gets the glory, the generals get to live. His personal habits were notorious, even by Roman imperial standards. He gambled heavily, spent enormous sums on banquets and entertainments, and generally treated the imperial treasury like a personal fund for expensive hobbies. Ancient sources describe parties lasting until dawn, performances with exotic animals, and expenditures that made even other wealthy Romans uncomfortable. He wasn't cruel in the creative way that some emperors were, just casually indifferent to suffering while pursuing pleasure. The troops returning from the Parthian campaign brought back plague, the Antonine plague that would devastate the empire for years. Whether they caught it in Mesopotamia or Syria, It spread along military routes and trade roads, killing millions. Verus himself died from it in 169, possibly the plague or possibly a stroke. He died in Marcus's arms, according to sources, which is touching until you remember all the people who died less comfortably because of campaigns he nominally commanded. Next, an emperor who bought the throne and paid the price. Didius Julianus bought the throne, paid in blood. Didius Julianus ruled for 66 days in 193, and his reign is remembered primarily for how he got the job. After the Praetorian Guard murdered Emperor Pertinax, they literally auctioned off the imperial throne to the highest bidder. Didius Julianus showed up and offered 25,000 sesterces per guard. He won the auction, marched into the palace, and discovered that buying the emperorship was significantly easier than keeping it. It's the Roman Empire's most embarrassing example of treating government like a commodity, and that's a competitive category. The Senate, horrified but powerless, confirmed him as emperor because the Praetorian Guard had swords and the senators didn't. The population of Rome was appalled. 3 provincial governors immediately declared themselves emperor and marched on the capital with actual armies. Didius Julianus sat in the palace realizing he'd purchased a throne that came with multiple people trying to kill him, and his only supporters were the guards he'd bribed, who would clearly switch sides for a better offer. His brief reign consisted mostly of panic. He tried to win popular support by throwing games and distributing money, but Romans weren't impressed by an emperor who'd bought the position like it was furniture at auction. He attempted to negotiate with the approaching armies, offering to share power, which just made him look weak and desperate. He tried to have his rival Septimius Severus assassinated, but the assassins either failed or decided switching sides was safer. The violence of his reign was less about active cruelty and more about the chaos of a collapsing legitimacy. People died in street fights between his supporters and opponents. He ordered executions of suspected conspirators, but everyone was conspiring because everyone could see he was doomed. The Praetorian Guard, realizing they'd backed a losing horse, abandoned him. The Senate, sensing which way things were going, declared him a public enemy and condemned him to death. When Septimius Severus's forces approached Rome, Didius Julianus was in the palace essentially alone. A soldier was sent to execute him. According to tradition, his last words were, "But what evil have I done? Whom have I killed?" which shows a remarkable lack of self-awareness. You didn't kill anyone personally, Didius, but you treated the emperorship like a purchasable commodity, and that helped break what little remained of the system's dignity. His head was brought to Severus as proof. The auction emperor lasted 66 days, which might be a record for worst return on investment in Roman history. Next, an emperor who took military discipline too far. Probus, discipline taken too far. Probus ruled from 276 to 282. 6 years of military campaigns and infrastructure projects enforced with the kind of rigid discipline that eventually got him killed by his own soldiers. He was a capable general who became emperor during the continuing chaos of the 3rd century, and he took the job seriously, perhaps too seriously. There's effective leadership, and then there's working your troops so hard they decide murder is preferable to another day under your command. His military campaigns were relentlessly efficient. He fought Germanic tribes along the Rhine and Danube, defeated usurpers in Gaul, campaigned against the Persians, and generally spent his entire reign moving from one frontier crisis to another. The pattern was always the same. Identify the threat, march the legions there, defeat the enemy with overwhelming force, establish new defences, move to the next problem. Romans were good at systematic conquest, and Probus was particularly systematic. The defeated populations faced standard Roman treatment. Leaders were executed, warriors enslaved or recruited into auxiliary units, and civilians were either absorbed into the empire or pushed beyond the frontier to become someone else's problem. When tribes raided Roman territory, Probus responded with punitive expeditions that burned villages and destroyed food supplies, making sure the cost of attacking Rome was higher than any potential benefit. But his real innovation was putting soldiers to work during peacetime. When legions weren't fighting, Probus had them drain swamps, plant vineyards, build roads, and construct fortifications. It was practical. Idle soldiers caused trouble, and the empire needed infrastructure, but soldiers signed up to fight, not to be unpaid labourers on agricultural projects. The legions started to resent being treated like a construction company with weapons. The discipline was harsh. Soldiers who complained faced punishment. Units that performed poorly were decimated or assigned worse tasks. Probus ran the army like it was a machine, efficient but inhuman. He reportedly said that he hoped to make soldiers unnecessary, that Rome could achieve such perfect peace that armies would become obsolete. The soldiers hearing this wondered what exactly would happen to them in this peaceful future, and the answer didn't seem promising. In 282, troops stationed near his hometown of Sirmium were assigned to drain a swamp. They'd been marching and fighting for years, and now they were digging ditches in a swamp because the emperor wanted his hometown to have better land drainage. They snapped. A group of soldiers hunted down Probus and killed him, reportedly in the tower where he'd taken refuge. The efficient disciplinarian died because he forgot that soldiers are people, not tools. Next, an emperor whose brief reign ended mysteriously. Carus, brief but brutal. Carus ruled from 282 to 283, just a year or so, which barely qualifies as a reign. It's more like a violent intermission between other violent intermissions. He was the Praetorian prefect under Probus, and when soldiers murdered Probus for working them too hard, Carus smoothly transitioned from loyal subordinate to emperor. Whether he encouraged the murder or simply benefited from convenient timing is the kind of question that ancient sources love to hint at without confirming. Either way, the pattern was familiar. Emperor dies, closest powerful person becomes next emperor. Everyone pretends this is a legitimate succession. He immediately elevated his two sons, Carinus and Numerian, as co-emperors, which showed either optimism about family loyalty or a fundamental misunderstanding of Roman imperial history. Dynasties tended to end in fratricide and betrayal, but Carinus apparently hoped his sons would be the exception. Spoiler, they weren't. His military campaigns showed the standard Roman approach to warfare. He immediately launched an invasion of Persia, which was becoming something of a 3rd century tradition. Roman emperors needed military victories to maintain legitimacy with the troops, and Persia was always available as a target. Carus defeated Persian forces, captured cities including Ctesiphon, the Persian capital, and his troops sacked it with the usual efficiency. Looting, burning, enslaving, the complete package of Roman conquest. The Persian royal family fled, and briefly it looked like Carus might actually succeed where so many others had failed. Then he died. The official story is that he was struck by lightning while in his tent. Lightning. The ancient sources report this with the kind of tone that suggests they didn't entirely believe it either, but what else could they say? Maybe it really was lightning. Maybe it was assassination staged to look like natural causes. Maybe it was illness that people explained as divine intervention because admitting the emperor died from dysentery lacked gravitas. His sudden death meant his campaigns ended immediately. The army retreated from Persia, taking their loot but leaving their conquests. Numerian took command in the east. Carinus continued ruling in the west. The brothers would both be dead within 2 years, because the one thing Carinus' sons learned from their father was that imperial succession involved a lot of murder. Lightning or assassination. Carus' brief reign left almost no lasting impact beyond proving that quick campaigns against Persia were tactically possible, but strategically pointless. If you died before consolidating gains. Next, his decadent son, who outlasted his brother briefly. Carinus. Decadent and deadly. Carinus ruled from 283 to 285, first alongside his father Carene and brother Numerian, then alone after they both conveniently died, and finally not at all after his own troops decided they'd had enough. He was left in charge of the Western Empire while his father and brother campaigned in Persia, which meant he got to stay in Rome and enjoy being emperor without the inconvenient parts like actual warfare. He took to this arrangement with enthusiasm that alarmed even Romans accustomed to imperial excess. Ancient sources paint him as the stereotype of the decadent tyrant. He allegedly married and divorced 9 different women in quick succession, treated the Senate with open contempt, and spent lavishly on games and entertainments while ignoring administration. Whether all of this is accurate or just standard character assassination from historians who didn't like him is debatable, but the consistency of the negative portrait suggests at least some of it was true. When multiple sources agree you were terrible, you probably were. His treatment of perceived rivals was swift and brutal. Senators who might have support or influence were executed on vague charges. Wealthy citizens had their property confiscated, sometimes with accusations of conspiracy, sometimes without bothering with pretense. Carinus needed money for his extravagances, and taking it from the rich was easier than responsible financial management. The Senate hated him, but the Senate had limited options when the emperor controlled the Praetorian Guard. He did actually fight when required. When his brother Numerian died in 284 and Diocletian was proclaimed emperor by the eastern troops, Carinus marched east to dispute the claim. At the Battle of the Margus in 285, his forces were initially winning. Carinus was apparently a capable commander when he bothered to pay attention. Then, in the middle of the battle, one of his officers assassinated him. The officer's motive was reportedly personal. Carinus had seduced his wife. Whether that's true or convenient justification for murder doesn't really matter. Carinus died, his troops accepted Diocletian, and the brief reign of excess ended on a battlefield far from Rome's pleasures. His death meant Diocletian could begin the reforms that would restructure the empire and end the crisis of the 3rd century. In a way, Carinus' assassination was one of the more historically productive murders in Roman history. His legacy was being so ineffective that his death improved things, which isn't exactly what anyone wants on their historical tombstone. Now let's step back further in time to the founder of the imperial system itself, Augustus. Ruthless rise, peaceful reign. Augustus ruled from 27 BC to 14 AD, 41 years that transformed Rome from republic to empire, and his reign is remembered as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Which is true, eventually, but the peace came after decades of civil war, proscriptions, and systematic elimination of anyone who stood between young Octavian and absolute power. Augustus, the peaceful emperor, was built on foundations of Octavian, the ruthless politician, and those foundations were soaked in Roman blood. Let's start with the second triumvirate's proscriptions in 43 BC. Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus formed a political alliance and immediately drew up lists of enemies to be killed. Not arrested, not exiled, killed, with their property confiscated to fund the triumvirate's armies. The estimates vary, but somewhere between 130 and 300 senators were proscribed, along with 2,000 equestrians. Men were hunted through Rome and Italy, murdered in their homes, on the streets, in temples where they'd sought sanctuary. Heads were displayed in the Forum. Marcus Tullius Cicero, the great orator and statesman, was caught fleeing and beheaded. His head and hands were nailed to the speaker's platform, where he delivered speeches for decades. Octavian was 18 years old when he endorsed this. 18. He'd inherited Caesar's name and fortune, and immediately used both to fund murder on an industrial scale. The justification was that these men had supported Caesar's assassins, or might oppose the triumvirate. The reality was that many were simply wealthy and their deaths were convenient. The civil wars that followed were brutal, even by Roman standards. The Battle of Philippi in 42 BC killed tens of thousands. The naval campaigns against Sextus Pompey involved starvation sieges, mass executions of captured enemies, and wholesale confiscations of property. When Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra at Actium in 31 BC, he followed them to Egypt and annexed the kingdom. Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide. Octavian had Cleopatra's son Caesarion, Julius Caesar's alleged child, hunted down and killed. Can't have competing heirs. But then, something interesting happened. Once Octavian had eliminated all rivals and secured absolute power, becoming Augustus in 27 BC, he stopped. The proscriptions ended. The civil wars ceased. He governed competently, reformed administration, patronized the arts, and gave Rome stability. The man who'd killed his way to power spent 4 decades proving he could actually rule. The brutality was instrumental, not pathological. Once he had what he wanted, he put away the knife. Next, a practical emperor who built his success on other people's suffering. Vespasian. Practical, not pleasant. Vespasian ruled from 69 to 79, 10 years of practical governance and financial recovery after the chaos of Nero's fall and the year of the 4 emperors. He was a military man from a middle-class family, not an aristocrat, which meant he approached empire with the efficiency of someone who'd actually worked for a living. He stabilized finances, rebuilt Rome, and restored military discipline. He He was also perfectly willing to use violence, taxation, and mass destruction when they served his purposes. Competence and cruelty aren't mutually exclusive. He came to power through civil war, which meant thousands died before he ever sat on the throne. His forces defeated Vitellius's troops in battles across Italy, culminating in street fighting in Rome itself, where the capital burned and citizens died in the crossfire. When Vitellius was captured, he was dragged through the streets, tortured and killed. His body was thrown in the Tiber. Vespasian didn't order the specific brutality, but he benefited from it, and he didn't punish anyone involved. Message delivered. Opposing Vespasian ended badly. The Jewish War, which he'd been commanding before becoming emperor, showed Roman military efficiency at its darkest. His son Titus continued the siege of Jerusalem in 70, while Vespasian took power, but the campaign's brutality reflected years of Vespasian's command. The siege involved starvation, crucifixions of escapees within sight of the walls, and eventually the total destruction of Jerusalem and its temple. The Jewish population was massacred or enslaved by the tens of thousands. Titus returned to Rome with enough captives to build the Colosseum using their labour. The Arch of Titus, still standing, depicts the spoils looted from the temple. It's a monument to methodical conquest. Vespasian's financial reforms squeezed provinces and citizens alike. He needed money to rebuild after Nero's excesses and the civil war's destruction, so he raised taxes, invented new fees, and famously taxed public urinals. His supposed deathbed words were, "I think I'm becoming a god," delivered with the dry humour of someone who knew how ridiculous emperor worship was, but accepted it as useful. He died of natural causes in 79, which made him one of the lucky ones. His legacy was stability purchased with Jewish suffering and heavy taxation. He proved the empire could recover from chaos if the emperor was competent and willing to make hard, often brutal choices. Romans remembered him fondly, which says something about how much they valued order over gentleness. Next, the conqueror who expanded the empire to its greatest extent. Trajan conquest has a cost. Trajan ruled from 98 to 117, 19 years that saw the Roman Empire reach its maximum territorial extent. The Senate declared him Optimus Princeps, the best emperor, and history has generally agreed with that assessment. He was competent, built extensively, treated the Senate with respect, and maintained good relations with virtually everyone. He's one of the few emperors with almost no negative ancient sources, but conquest, even successful conquest led by a beloved emperor, involves a staggering amount of death. Expansion means someone else loses, and they lose hard. The Dacian Wars, from 101 to 106, eliminated the Dacian kingdom in what's now Romania. 2 campaigns, multiple battles, and the complete subjugation of a people who'd resisted Rome for generations. The capital Samosata was besieged, captured and destroyed. King Decebalus committed suicide rather than be captured. The Dacian population was enslaved, killed or displaced. Roman colonists replaced them, which is why Romanian language has Latin roots today. Its colonization is complete cultural replacement, and it required violence on a massive scale. Trajan's column in Rome depicts the wars in detailed relief carvings that wind around the monument. It shows battles, sieges, the mass deportation of Dacians, and Roman legionaries building fortifications over conquered territory. It's propaganda, obviously. But even propaganda reveals truth. The images show bound captives, burning villages, and systematic military occupation. The column was a monument to victory built with wealth extracted from Dacian gold mines that would fund Roman projects for decades. The Parthian War from 114 to 117 pushed Roman borders to Mesopotamia temporarily. Trajan captured Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital, just like emperors before and after him would. Cities were sacked, populations enslaved, and Roman soldiers looted everything valuable. But the expansion was unsustainable. Revolts broke out in the newly conquered territories and in the rear areas. Jewish populations in Cyrenaica, Egypt and Cyprus rebelled, leading to vicious ethnic conflicts where thousands died on all sides. Trajan's response to rebellion was methodical suppression. Generals were sent with orders to restore order, which meant crucifixions, mass executions, and the destruction of communities that had supported rebels. It was standard Roman practice, just executed efficiently under an efficient emperor. Trajan died in 117 while returning from the east, possibly from a stroke. He'd expanded the empire to its greatest size. His successor Hadrian would immediately start giving some of it back because it was ungovernable. Next we examine an emperor so gentle he seems out of place in this list. Tacitus. Elderly strictness. Tacitus ruled from 275 to 276, 6 months of elderly confusion masquerading as imperial authority. He was 75 years old when the army and senate made him emperor after Aurelian's assassination, which should tell you how desperate the situation was. When your solution to political instability is putting a man who should be enjoying retirement in charge of an empire under siege from all directions, you've run out of good options. Tacitus allegedly didn't want the job, which is one of the few sensible reactions to being offered the throne in the 3rd century. His brief reign was less about active policy and more about trying to maintain the status quo while everyone waited to see who would murder him. He did make efforts. He campaigned against Germanic tribes along the borders, or at least his generals did, while Tacitus travelled with the army. The victories were modest, the kind of punitive expeditions that pushed raiders back temporarily without solving underlying problems. Prisoners were executed, villages burned, the usual frontier warfare that had been going on for centuries. His strictness came through in military discipline. He was old enough to remember when Roman legions had standards, and he tried to reimpose them on armies that had grown accustomed to making and unmaking emperors. Soldiers who looted excessively or broke ranks faced harsh punishment. Units that performed poorly were publicly shamed. It was the discipline of someone who'd lived through better times and couldn't understand why the current generation didn't maintain those standards. The troops tolerated it because he was old and clearly temporary. The executions under his reign were mostly administrative, dealing with supporters of previous usurpers or potential new ones. Nothing creative, just the maintenance work of eliminating threats before they became problems. When you're a 75-year-old emperor, you don't have time for elaborate conspiracies or long-term planning. You identify problems and remove them quickly, hoping you'll survive long enough to die naturally. He didn't. In 276, after 6 months of rule, he died during a campaign in Anatolia. The sources variously claim illness, assassination by his own troops, or murder by the Praetorian prefect who succeeded him. Given the pattern, assassination seems most likely. The elderly experiment in leadership ended, and the empire moved on to the next crisis with barely a pause. Tacitus's main contribution to Roman history was demonstrating that age and experience don't matter much when everyone around you has swords and ambition. Next, an emperor whose death was stranger than his life. Numerian. Mystery and mild menace. Numerian ruled from 283 to 284, a year of increasing strangeness that ended with one of the odder deaths in Roman imperial history. He was the younger son of Emperor Carus, left to command the eastern armies after his father was allegedly struck by lightning in Persia. His older brother Carinus ruled the west, and for a brief moment the family arrangement almost worked. Then Numerian started acting oddly. His Praetorian prefect became suspiciously controlling, and everything fell apart in the way Roman successions tended to. He began the retreat from Persia after his father's death, which was sensible. The conquests weren't sustainable, and staying in hostile territory with a new untested emperor seemed unwise. But during the long march back through Mesopotamia and Asia Minor, Numerian developed an eye condition, also his Praetorian prefect Appa claimed. The emperor travelled in a closed litter, supposedly to protect his sensitive eyes from sunlight. He stopped making public appearances. Communications came through Appa, who explained that the emperor needed rest and darkness. The soldiers started to wonder why their emperor had become invisible. When the litter began to smell, they really started to wonder. Eventually, someone opened the curtains and discovered Numerian's decomposing body. He'd been dead for days, possibly weeks, while Appa continued issuing orders in his name and keeping the corpse travelling with the army. Whether Appa murdered him or Numerian died naturally, and Appa tried to maintain control by hiding the death remains unclear. Either way, it's one of history's more macabre examples of weekend at Bernie's political theatre. Appa's plan, whatever it was, failed immediately. The generals called an assembly, and Diocletian, commander of the imperial bodyguard, was proclaimed emperor. Diocletian's first act was to dramatically execute Appa personally, claiming either justice for murder or revenge for conspiracy, depending on which story you believe. Appa died, Numerian's decomposed body was buried, and Diocletian marched west to deal with Carinus. As for Numerian's actual reign, it's hard to evaluate. He was emperor for about a year, spent most of it retreating from Persia, and the only notable thing was dying mysteriously in a covered litter. He apparently wrote poetry and had intellectual interests, which made him unusual for military emperors of the 3rd century. But poetry doesn't leave much historical record compared to military campaigns and massacres. His legacy as being the emperor who might have been murdered or might have died inconveniently, then was hidden like embarrassing luggage. Now let's examine an emperor too brief to cause much harm. Florian, too brief to be brutal. Florian ruled for 88 days in 276, which barely qualifies as ruling at all. It's more like he stood near the throne for about 3 months while everyone decided whether to take him seriously. He was the half-brother of Emperor Tacitus, and when Tacitus died, Florian assumed power by proximity and optimism rather than any actual legitimacy. The Praetorian Guard in the west accepted him. The eastern armies had other ideas. 88 days later, those ideas involved Florian being dead. His brief tenure didn't give him much opportunity for documented brutality, which is probably the kindest thing you can say about an emperor. He inherited the same frontier problems everyone else faced. Germanic tribes probing borders, economic instability, military units that changed loyalty based on who paid them most recently. Florian attempted to assert authority by marching east to confront Probus, who the Eastern legions had declared emperor. It was the standard 3rd century solution to political disagreement. 2 armies marched toward each other. Eventually one emperor is dead, problem solved. Except Florian's troops decided the problem was Florian. Before the armies even properly engaged, his own soldiers killed him. The sources disagree on details, as they usually do. Some say he was assassinated by officers who decided Probus was the better bet. Others claim he was forced to commit suicide when his troops mutinied. Either way, the message was clear. The soldiers weren't invested in defending Florian's claim when switching to Probus seemed safer and potentially more profitable. During his brief rule, the governance was probably standard crisis-era management. Keep the borders defended, try to maintain supply lines, execute anyone who looked like they might rebel before they could organize. The 3rd century had reduced imperial administration to basics: pay soldiers, fight invaders, eliminate rivals, repeat. Florian followed the playbook but didn't last long enough to add personal variations. His death cleared the way for Probus, who would rule for 6 years of military campaigns and infrastructure projects, before his own troops killed him for working them too hard. It's a pattern that defined the era. Emperors rose from the military, ruled through military force, and died when the military decided they were inconvenient. Florian's contribution was being so forgettable that his main historical distinction is having one of the shortest reigns on record. Next, another forgettable placeholder who barely made an impression: Constans' forgotten middle son. Constans ruled from 337 to 350, 13 years that history mostly forgot because he was the middle son of Constantine the Great, and middle children rarely get the attention. When Constantine died in 337, he left the empire divided among his 3 sons, Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans. It was the kind of family arrangement that sounds reasonable in theory, and immediately devolves into fratricide in practice. Constantine II died fighting Constans in 340, leaving Constans to rule the Western Empire, while his brother Constantius II held the East. The initial conflict between the brothers set the tone. Constantine II invaded Italy to assert dominance over Constans, who was younger and supposedly easier to intimidate. Instead, Constans's forces ambushed and killed Constantine II near Aquileia. The eldest brother died in a river, his body lost, and Constans absorbed his territories without apparent remorse. Family loyalty in the 4th century imperial household meant very little compared to territorial control. Constans's treatment of religious minorities showed the casual brutality that had become standard once Christianity gained imperial backing. He enforced orthodoxy with laws that closed pagan temples and banned traditional sacrifices. The transition from paganism to Christianity wasn't gentle persuasion. It was imperial decree backed by confiscations, imprisonments, and social ostracism. Communities that had worshipped traditional gods for centuries faced the choice of conversion or marginalization. His military campaigns followed established patterns. He fought successfully against Franks along the Rhine, campaigned in Britain against Picts and Scots, and generally maintained borders through the usual combination of military force and strategic fortifications. Defeated enemies were killed, enslaved, or recruited into Roman auxiliary units depending on utility. The western provinces under his rule saw relative stability, which is praised by comparison in the 4th century. But his personal behaviour alienated the army. Sources describe him as increasingly erratic and possibly involved in scandalous relationships that offended military sensibilities. Whether this was true or propaganda from his eventual killers, it provided justification for rebellion. In 350, Magnentius, one of his generals, declared himself emperor. Constans fled but was caught and killed by Magnentius's agents. He was 30 years old. His death triggered another civil war as Constantius II marched west to avenge his brother and eliminate the usurper. The civil war killed tens of thousands and devastated Gaul and Italy. Constantius' legacy was being the middle son who survived one brother, ruled adequately, and died violently, triggering more violence. Next, another placeholder emperor lost in the chaos of transition. Jovian, the placeholder. Jovian ruled from 363 to 364, 8 months of desperate damage control after the disastrous reign and death of Julian the Apostate. He was elected emperor by the army, while trapped deep in Persian territory after Julian died from a wound during the retreat. The troops needed someone immediately, and Jovian was there, relatively senior and importantly still alive. He accepted the position probably because refusing wasn't really an option when surrounded by nervous soldiers in enemy territory who needed a commander. His first act as emperor was signing a peace treaty with Persia that gave back territories Rome had fought for decades to acquire. It was humiliating but necessary. The army was starving, exhausted and surrounded. Jovian traded land for safe passage home, and while Romans would remember this as a shameful treaty, it kept the army from being annihilated in Mesopotamia. Pragmatic decisions often look like weakness from a distance, but the soldiers who survived probably appreciated not dying in the desert. The religious reversals came immediately. Julian had tried to restore paganism and marginalize Christianity. Jovian was Christian and reversed course, restoring Christian privileges and beginning the process of re-establishing orthodoxy. Pagan temples that Julian had reopened faced closure again. It wasn't systematic persecution yet, more like administrative whiplash as the empire's religious policy changed direction with each emperor. But the pattern was clear. Christianity was regaining imperial favour, and pagans could read the trajectory. His actual governance lasted barely long enough to matter. He travelled from Persia back toward Constantinople, dealing with administrative issues along the way, but mostly just trying to reach the capital and establish legitimate control. He never made it. In February 364, Jovian died in his sleep in Bithynia. The official cause was either a brazier filling his room with fumes, or overeating after a feast, charcoal poisoning or gluttony. Either way, he was dead at age 33, after 8 months as emperor. His death left the empire leaderless again, and the generals met to choose a successor, eventually selecting Valentinian. Jovian's contribution to history was being the transitional figure who got the army home and reversed Julian's religious policies before dying unexpectedly. He didn't rule long enough to develop a reputation for brutality or mercy. He was just there, briefly, then gone. In an era of dramatic emperors with dramatic ends, Jovian managed to be forgettable, which might actually be an achievement. Now let's move to emperors who at least tried to be decent. Claudius, accidentally brutal. Claudius ruled from 41 to 54, 13 years of competent administration undermined by the fact that he seemed genuinely surprised to be emperor, and never quite figured out how to control the people around him. He was the uncle of Caligula, found hiding behind a curtain in the palace after the Praetorian Guard murdered his nephew. The guards needed an emperor quickly before the Senate could organize, and Claudius was the only adult male in the imperial family still breathing. They dragged him out, declared him emperor, and Claudius spent the next 13 years being manipulated by wives, freedmen and advisors, while occasionally doing actually useful things for the empire. His problem was that he was surrounded by people more ruthless than he was, and they used his authority to eliminate their rivals. His third wife, Messalina, orchestrated executions of senators and wealthy citizens she saw as threats or whose property she wanted. Claudius signed the death warrants because Messalina told him these people were dangerous conspirators. Some probably were, many probably weren't. Messalina's execution spree only ended when she made the spectacular mistake of going through a marriage ceremony with another man while still married to the emperor. Even Claudius noticed that she was executed in 48. Then came his fourth wife, Agrippina the Younger, who was arguably worse. She convinced Claudius to adopt her son Nero and make him heir over Claudius's own biological son, Britannicus. She eliminated anyone who objected through a combination of exile, forced suicide, and assassination. Claudius again signed off on these actions, trusting that his wife knew best. Agrippina almost certainly poisoned Claudius in 54, using mushrooms at dinner because keeping him alive once Nero was positioned to inherit served no purpose. His military campaigns were more directly his responsibility. The conquest of Britain beginning in 43 showed standard Roman efficiency. Claudius personally visited Britain for 16 days to claim credit for victories. His generals had won, British tribes were defeated, their leaders killed or captured, and the process of Romanization began with the usual combination of military occupation and cultural suppression. Caracalla, the British resistance leader, was eventually captured and brought to Rome in chains, though Claudius spared his life in an unusual show of mercy. Claudius also expelled Jews from Rome in response to disturbances, possibly related to early Christian preaching. The expulsion wasn't genocidal but still displaced thousands from their homes and businesses. It was administrative ethnic cleansing, bureaucratic rather than violent. His reign proved that you could be personally decent and still preside over significant brutality, especially when everyone around you was murderous. Next, an emperor remembered for financial stinginess rather than violence. Galba stingy severity. Galba ruled from 68 to 69, 7 months of stern fiscal responsibility that somehow managed to alienate everyone simultaneously. He was 73 years old when he became emperor after Nero's suicide, a respected general and provincial governor with a reputation for old-fashioned Roman discipline. The Romans thought they were getting stability and traditional values. They got an elderly man who combined rigidity with poor judgment, which turned out to be a fatal combination. His first acts as emperor involved not paying people what they'd been promised. The Praetorian Guard had been assured bonuses for supporting him. Galba decided the treasury couldn't afford it and refused to pay. Soldiers who'd expected rewards for backing the winning side got stern lectures about fiscal responsibility instead. This is exactly how you ensure your Praetorian Guard starts shopping for a new emperor immediately. You can be many things as a Roman emperor: competent, cruel, insane, but you cannot be cheap with the soldiers who keep you alive. His severity extended to punishing Nero's supporters, which made sense politically but was carried out with harsh efficiency. Executions, forced suicides, and confiscations removed anyone suspected of excessive loyalty to the previous regime. Galba wasn't personally sadistic like Nero, but he was ruthlessly practical. People who'd benefited from Nero's favour lost everything, often including their lives. The message was clear: the new administration rewarded austerity and punished indulgence. He also made the catastrophic decision to adopt Piso Licinianus as his heir instead of Otho, who'd been a loyal supporter and expected the position. Otho had money, connections, and soldiers who liked him. Piso was a nobleman with an impressive bloodline and nothing else. Galba chose aristocratic pedigree over political reality, which is the kind of decision that feels traditional right up until someone stabs you. The stabbing came in January 69. Otho bribed the Praetorian Guard, the same guards Galba had refused to pay, and they assassinated both Galba and Piso in the Forum. Galba was beheaded, and his head was carried around on a pike. He'd ruled for 7 months and managed to make enemies of the military, the aristocracy, and the common people, through a combination of stinginess, rigidity, and poor political judgment. His legacy was proving that traditional Roman virtue without practical sense gets you killed efficiently. Next, an emperor who at least showed some decency before his brief end. Though brief and relatively merciful. Otho ruled from January to April 69, 3 months during the year of the 4 emperors. He came to power by bribing the Praetorian Guard to murder Galba, then spent his brief reign trying to consolidate control while Vitellius marched from Germany with legions who declared him emperor instead. It was the kind of situation where brutality would have been expected and probably justified by Roman standards, but Otho surprised everyone by showing occasional restraint. Not constantly, not systematically, but enough that sources comment on it as unusual. After murdering Galba and Piso, Otho could have unleashed a purge of their supporters. He didn't. He executed some of the most prominent Galban loyalists, the ones who might organize resistance, but he showed clemency to many others. Several senators who'd supported Galba were allowed to keep their positions and property, which was generous by Roman imperial succession standards. Otho wanted legitimacy, and mass executions of the aristocracy wouldn't help his image as the better alternative to the elderly, stingy Galba. He tried to govern competently during his 3 months, addressing administrative issues and attempting to restore order after Nero's chaotic final year and Galba's disastrous brief reign. He showed respect to the Senate, or at least performed respect convincingly. He distributed money carefully, trying to balance keeping the Praetorian Guard happy while not bankrupting the treasury like Nero had. It was responsible administration under impossible circumstances. The problem was Vitellius and the German legions marching on Italy. Otho gathered forces and marched north to meet them. The armies clashed at Bedriacum in April 69 and Otho's forces lost. Here's where Otho did something unusual for a Roman emperor. Instead of prolonging the civil war, instead of retreating and regrouping and causing more Roman bloodshed, he committed suicide. His last words were reportedly about not wanting to cause more suffering, not wanting Romans to keep killing Romans on his behalf. Whether this was nobility or pragmatism is debatable. Maybe he saw the situation was hopeless and chose dignified suicide over eventual capture and execution. Maybe he genuinely wanted to spare Italy more civil war devastation. Either way, the effect was the same. He died, his supporters surrendered to Vitellius, and the civil war ended more quickly than it might have. His restraint in power and his suicide to end conflict made him one of the more sympathetic figures in the chaotic year of the 4 emperors. Next, an emperor whose gluttony became legendary. Vitellius. Gluttonous, not genocidal. Vitellius ruled from April to December 69, 8 months of extravagant banquets while the empire burned through money and patience. He was declared emperor by the German legions, defeated Otho at Bedriacum, and marched into Rome expecting to enjoy the rewards of victory. What he enjoyed most was food. Ancient sources describe his appetite with a kind of detailed disgust usually reserved for moral failings, and in Rome excessive eating was a moral failing. Vitellius reportedly held 4 feasts a day, and would induce vomiting to make room for more. Is the kind of behaviour that makes for memorable historical anecdotes, even if some details are exaggerated. His cruelty was less systematic than many emperors, more the casual violence of someone who hadn't thought through consequences. He executed centurions and soldiers who'd supported Otho, which was standard victor's justice. He confiscated property from Othonian supporters to fund his government and lifestyle. But the brutality wasn't creative or sadistic. It was just the default setting for Roman political transitions. You won, they lost, they paid with lives and property. Vitellius followed the pattern without adding personal innovations. His real problem was that while he was feasting, the Eastern legions declared Vespasian emperor. Another civil war, another army marching on Italy. Vespasian's forces, led by his general Antonius Primus, moved faster and fought harder than Vitellius expected. The Second Battle of Bedriacum in October 69 resulted in Vitellian defeat. Vespasian's troops marched on Rome, and Vitellius, watching his power collapse, tried to negotiate abdication. He wanted to retire safely and live quietly. Rome had other plans. The city descended into street fighting as Vitellian and Flavian forces battled in the Forum and on the Capitoline Hill. The Temple of Jupiter burned during the fighting, a disaster that shocked Romans even amid civil war. When Vespasian's forces finally won, they found Vitellius hiding in the palace. He was dragged through the streets, tortured, mocked for his obesity and cowardice, and killed. His body was thrown in the Tiber, the standard disposal method for disgraced emperors. Vitellius's legacy was being the gluttonous emperor between Otho and Vespasian, the man who loved food more than power and lost both. His brutality was unremarkable by imperial standards. He killed opponents because that's what emperors did, but he's remembered for banquets and vomiting and dying badly, which tells you that sometimes being memorably undignified overshadows being moderately cruel. Now let's move toward emperors whose violence was situational rather than characteristic. Julian the Apostate, the philosopher-soldier. Julian ruled from 361 to 363, just 2 years of attempting to reverse a century of Christian dominance and restore paganism as Rome's religion. He was the last pagan emperor, a philosopher who'd studied classical texts and Greek philosophy while his cousin Constantius II murdered most of their family. Julian survived by being useful and unthreatening until Constantius made him Caesar and sent him to Gaul to deal with Germanic invasions. Turns out Julian was actually competent, and his troops declared him Augustus in 360. Constantius died before they could fight a civil war, and Julian inherited an empire he intended to transform. His religious policy wasn't persecution in the Christian torturing pagan sense, but it wasn't gentle either. He reopened pagan temples and removed Christian privileges. Christians who destroyed pagan temples during previous reigns were ordered to rebuild them at their own expense. Christian teachers were barred from teaching classical literature, which effectively meant Christians couldn't teach, since classical texts formed education's foundation. It was administrative pressure designed to marginalize Christianity without creating martyrs. Death made martyrs. Professional exclusion just made people poor and resentful. Some Christians died under his reign. Though Julian's direct responsibility is debated, in Alexandria, riots between pagans and Christians resulted in deaths on both sides. In Gaza and other cities, Christian communities faced mob violence from emboldened pagans who felt the emperor's policy protected them. Julian didn't order massacres, but his rhetoric encouraged violence by making Christians targets. When the emperor openly mocks your religion and removes your legal protections, enthusiastic pagans take that as permission. His military campaigns showed standard Roman ruthlessness. He campaigned successfully in Gaul against Alemanni and Franks with victories that involved the usual Roman pattern of defeating tribal warriors, burning settlements and establishing fortified positions. Germanic captives were enslaved or recruited into auxiliary units. It was efficient frontier warfare without unnecessary cruelty, but also without mercy. The Persian campaign in 363 was his fatal mistake. He invaded Persia with a large army, won initial victories, but got bogged down in extended campaigning deep in enemy territory. During a skirmish or retreat, sources disagree. Julian was wounded by a spear. The wound was serious, and he died a few days later at age 31. His last words were supposedly philosophical, about the nature of death and accepting fate. The Christian interpretation was that God struck him down for apostasy. The pagan interpretation was that a promising philosopher-emperor died too young. Either way, his death ended Rome's last serious attempt to restore paganism. Now we move to emperors whose decency stands out precisely because it was rare. Pertinax reform without bloodshed. Pertinax ruled from January to March 193, 87 days of attempting to restore fiscal responsibility and military discipline after Commodus's extravagant disasters. He was a career military officer and administrator, the son of a freed slave who'd risen through merit in an empire that still valued competence occasionally. When the Praetorian Guard murdered Commodus on New Year's Eve 192, they needed a respected replacement quickly. Pertinax was elderly, dignified, and seemed like a safe choice. He was in fact too safe and too dignified for soldiers who'd grown accustomed to generous bribes and lax discipline. His first actions as emperor showed restraint that was almost suicidal by Roman standards. He didn't conduct massive purges of Commodus's supporters. He didn't execute senators out of paranoia. Instead, he focused on boring, responsible governance. He tried to restore the treasury that Commodus had depleted through games and personal indulgences. He auctioned off imperial property, Commodus's gladiatorial equipment and concubines and exotic animals, trying to raise money without crushing the provinces with new taxes. It was sensible but unexciting. The problems started when he tried to restore military discipline. Soldiers who'd been allowed to loot and extort under Commodus suddenly faced an emperor who expected them to act like professional troops. Pertinax reduced their privileges, demanded better behaviour, and reminded them that being Praetorian Guards meant protecting the emperor, not terrorising Rome. This message was received poorly. Soldiers don't typically enjoy lectures about responsibility from the person whose authority depends entirely on their willingness to use violence on his behalf. 3 months in, a group of Praetorian Guards decided they were done with austerity and discipline. They marched on the palace Pertinax, rather than hiding or fleeing, met them and tried to reason with them. He gave a speech about duty, honour, and the responsibilities of guardsmen. They killed him anyway, stabbing him repeatedly while he stood there appealing to their better nature. It was the kind of death that makes you either admire his principles or question his survival instincts. His severed head was paraded through Rome on a spear, and the Praetorian Guard then auctioned the emperorship to the highest bidder. Didius Julianus bought it, proving that Pertinax's attempt at dignified reform had been replaced by the most undignified transaction in Roman political history. His legacy was being too decent for the job, which isn't the worst epitaph, but also isn't particularly useful when you're dead after 3 months. Next, the emperor who barely reigned but ruled peacefully, Nerva, the grandfather emperor. Nerva ruled from 96 to 98, just 16 months of elderly caretaker governance, after the Senate finally had enough of Domitian's paranoia and arranged his assassination. Nerva was 66 years old, a respected senator with no military background and no heirs, which made him perfect as a compromise candidate. He wasn't threatening to anyone because he probably wouldn't live long and couldn't establish a dynasty. The Senate wanted a break from imperial terror, and Nerva represented safety through harmlessness. His reign was marked by what he didn't do, which was refreshing after Domitian. He didn't conduct treason trials. He didn't execute senators for imagined conspiracies. He recalled exiles that Domitian had banished and restored confiscated properties where possible. He swore an oath that no senator would be executed during his reign, and remarkably he kept it. For Rome, having an emperor who didn't kill senators was notable enough to be his defining characteristic. He implemented moderate reforms aimed at helping the poor and restoring goodwill, land distribution programs for impoverished citizens, financial assistance for children in Italian communities, reduction of excessive taxation. It was compassionate governance, or at least the Roman version of it, which still involved an empire built on conquest and slavery, but tried to make life slightly less terrible for citizens. He treated the Senate with respect, consulting them on decisions, and acting like he was the first among equals rather than an autocrat, even though legally he had absolute power. The problem was the Praetorian Guard. They'd murdered Domitian at the Senate's behest, but they'd also been well paid by Domitian and didn't appreciate the new regime's emphasis on senatorial dignity over military privilege. In 97, the Guard mutinied, demanding that Nerva hand over the assassins who'd killed Domitian. Nerva refused, offering his own neck instead. It was a brave gesture that accomplished nothing. The Guard killed the assassins anyway, and Nerva was humiliated, proving he had authority only as long as the soldiers allowed it. His solution was adoption. He chose Trajan, a successful military commander with loyal legions, as his heir and co-emperor. It saved his reign and established the pattern of adoptive succession that would give Rome the 5 good emperors. 4 months after adopting Trajan, Nerva died of natural causes in 98. He'd avoided executions, restored some dignity to governance, and died peacefully, which made him one of the gentlest emperors Rome ever had. The bar was low, but he cleared it. Next, an emperor who contradicts his reputation as brutal, Titus, the people's favourite nice guy. Titus ruled from 79 to 81, just 2 years, but he managed to earn a reputation as one of Rome's most beloved emperors, despite spending his earlier career doing things that should have made him infamous. He was Vespasian's son and heir, and before becoming emperor he commanded the siege of Jerusalem in 70 that resulted in the temple's destruction, the city's devastation, and the death or enslavement of hundreds of thousands of Jews. The Arch of Titus, still standing in Rome, celebrates this victory with carved reliefs of looted temple treasures. It's a monument to one of history's great atrocities, and the man responsible later got remembered as the good emperor. History is complicated. But once he actually became emperor in 79, something shifted. Maybe the responsibility of sole rule changed him. Maybe he'd always been capable of empathy and just hadn't shown it while following his father's orders. Either way, Emperor Titus was remarkably different from General Titus. He stopped the treason trials that had continued under Vespasian. He didn't confiscate property or execute rivals. When people conspired against him, and they did because people always conspired against emperors, he forgave them. He reportedly said he'd rather die than kill a Roman citizen, which was the kind of statement that made senators weep with relief after decades of imperial paranoia. His reign was dominated by disasters that gave him opportunities to show compassion. Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79, burying Pompeii and Herculaneum and killing thousands. Titus personally oversaw relief efforts, donated imperial funds to survivors, and visited the affected areas. In 80, a great fire swept through Rome, followed immediately by a plague outbreak. Titus again threw imperial resources at helping citizens, rebuilding temples and public buildings, providing medical care. He sold imperial possessions to fund relief, treating public catastrophe as his personal responsibility. He completed the Colosseum that his father had started, opening it with 100 days of games that featured gladiatorial contests and animal hunts, but also free food distribution and public entertainment designed to restore Roman morale. It was propaganda, obviously, but propaganda paired with genuine effort to help people suffering from natural disasters. He died in 81, possibly from disease or possibly poisoned by his brother Domitian, who succeeded him and immediately reminded everyone that imperial niceness was the exception, not the rule. Titus's death was mourned genuinely, which almost never happened for Roman emperors. His 2-year reign proved that an emperor could be decent, at least once they actually had the throne and chose to be. Next, the emperor who defined peaceful competence. Antoninus Pius, peace personified. Antoninus Pius ruled from 138 to 161. 23 years of such remarkable tranquility that his reign feels almost out of place in Roman history. He's called pious because of his devotion to family and duty, and he earned the name through competent, boring governance that avoided drama, warfare, and the spectacular cruelties that made other emperors memorable. He didn't conquer new territories, he didn't persecute religious minorities systematically, he didn't execute senators or conduct treason trials, he just administered the empire efficiently, which turns out to be exactly what Rome needed after Hadrian's exhausting travels and occasional violence. He came to power because Hadrian adopted him as heir, and he immediately fulfilled his first duty by ensuring Hadrian's deification despite senatorial opposition. Hadrian had been unpopular with the Senate, but Antoninus insisted on honouring his adoptive father, which earned him the Pius title. It was loyalty to family duty over political convenience, unusual enough to be noteworthy. He also adopted Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus as his heirs, continuing the pattern of adoptive succession that was giving Rome stability. His reign was marked by what didn't happen. No major wars, though there were frontier conflicts in Britain, Germany and Dacia that were handled by generals without requiring the emperor's personal attention. The Antonine Wall was built in Scotland, pushing the frontier north of Hadrian's Wall, but the expansion was modest and defensive. No massive invasions, no dramatic conquests, just steady maintenance of existing borders. It was sustainable imperialism, if such a thing exists. He didn't travel outside Italy during his entire reign, which was almost unheard of for emperors of this era. He governed from Rome and his country estates, handling administration through correspondence and trusted officials. The provinces functioned well under his governors. Taxation remained stable and relatively reasonable. The legal system was reformed and clarified. It was all deeply unsexy governance that history barely remembers because competence without drama doesn't generate exciting stories. The persecutions of Christians that had occurred under previous emperors mostly stopped during his reign. Antoninus didn't convert to Christianity, but he also didn't see Christians as threats requiring systematic elimination. His reign was one of the more peaceful periods for early Christian communities, not because of official tolerance, but because of imperial indifference. When the emperor isn't actively interested in persecuting you, you can worship in relative peace. He died in 161 of natural causes at age 74, passing power smoothly to Marcus Aurelius. His death was peaceful, his succession orderly, his legacy boring in the best possible way. Majorian, the last hope. Majorian ruled the Western Roman Empire from 457 to 461. 4 years of genuine competence during the empire's final collapse. By the mid-5th century, the Western Empire was barely functional. Barbarian kingdoms controlled most of Gaul, Spain, and North Africa. The imperial court was dominated by Germanic generals who made and unmade emperors at will. Rome itself had been sacked twice in living memory. Into this catastrophe came Majorian, a capable general who actually tried to restore imperial authority rather than just collecting a paycheck while the empire disintegrated around him. He came to power with the support of Ricimer, the Germanic general who was the real power behind the throne. But unlike previous puppet emperors, Majorian had ideas about actually governing. He reformed the administration, reduced corruption, tried to restore the tax base that barbarian invasions had shattered. He treated the Senate with respect, issued laws protecting citizens from excessive taxation and official abuse, and generally acted like someone who believed the empire could be saved if people just worked at it. His military campaigns showed real skill. He defeated Germanic tribes in Gaul, restored some semblance of Roman authority in Spain, and prepared an invasion fleet to retake North Africa from the Vandals. North Africa was crucial. It had been the empire's breadbasket, and losing it to Vandal conquest meant Rome couldn't feed its population or fund its armies. Retaking it might actually stabilize the Western Empire. The fleet assembled at Cartagena represented Rome's last serious attempt at imperial reconquest. Then the Vandals destroyed the fleet in a surprise attack in 460. It was a catastrophic loss that ended any hope of recovering Africa. Majorian's credibility was shattered. Reconmer, watching the emperor's grand plans collapse, decided Majorian had outlived his usefulness. In 461, Reconmer forced Majorian to abdicate, then had him executed shortly after. The capable emperor who'd actually tried to save the empire was murdered by the Germanic general who'd put him in power. Majorian's brutality, such as it was, consisted of standard military campaigns against barbarian groups and enforcement of laws against corrupt officials. He wasn't gentle, but he was competent and relatively just. His execution marked the end of any real attempt to restore Western imperial authority. After Majorian, the Western emperors were purely ceremonial, puppet rulers serving Germanic generals until the last one, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in 476. And with that, we've covered the spectrum from monsters to the marginally decent. The Roman Empire offered variety, if nothing else. The crisis of the 3rd century, a parade of forgettable chaos. Between 235 and 284, the Roman Empire went through approximately 50 emperors, depending on how you count usurpers and co-emperors. That's 50 rulers in 50 years, which averages out to about 1 year per emperor. Some lasted longer, many lasted months, a few lasted weeks. It was half a century of military anarchy, where the primary qualification for becoming emperor was having an army, and the primary cause of death was having someone else's army show up. Let's talk about the ones who don't merit individual chapters, because honestly their reigns blurred together into one long nightmare of civil war, barbarian invasion, economic collapse and plague. They rose from the legions, ruled briefly, and died violently. Their names appear in lists that historians memorize and immediately forget. They made coins that archaeologists find centuries later and struggle to attribute because even contemporary sources couldn't keep track. Gordian II, the father-son duo who ruled together for 22 days in 238 before dying in Africa. They rebelled against Maximinus Thrax, briefly became emperors, then Gordian II died in battle, and Gordian IV hanged himself in grief. It was a remarkably compressed tragedy. The Senate, having backed them, panicked and appointed Pupienus and Balbinus, who we've already discussed. The year of the 6 emperors was exhausting for everyone involved. Trebonius Gallus ruled from 251 to 253, dealing with plague and Gothic invasions by paying the Goths tribute to leave, which worked temporarily but made him look weak. His own troops murdered him when another general, Aemilianus, marched on Italy. Aemilianus ruled for 88 days before his troops killed him too, when yet another general, Valerian, approached with a larger army. It was musical chairs where the loser died. Claudius Gothicus ruled from 268 to 270, earned his nickname by defeating Gothic invaders, and died of plague before he could consolidate power. Quintillus, possibly his brother, ruled for 17 days or several months depending on which source you trust, before dying violently and being forgotten almost immediately. The Gallic Empire, a breakaway state that controlled Gaul, Britain and Spain from 260 to 274, had its own succession of emperors, Postumus, Victorinus, Tetricus I, each ruling fragments of the western provinces while claiming imperial authority. They fought each other, fought Germanic tribes, and eventually were reabsorbed into the empire when Aurelian showed up with legions and ended the experiment in decentralization. The brutality of this era wasn't creative or personal. It was systematic and exhausting. The Gallic separatists and their violent ambitions. The Gallic Empire deserves slightly more attention than a passing mention because it represented something unusual, a successful breakaway state that lasted 14 years and controlled roughly a third of Roman territory. It started in 260 when Postumus, a military commander in Gaul, rebelled against Gallienus and declared himself Emperor of Gaul, Britain and Spain. The Central Empire was too busy with Persian wars, Gothic invasions and plague to stop him, so Postumus just ran his own Roman Empire with slightly different borders. Postumus actually governed competently. He maintained the frontiers against Germanic tribes, kept the Rhine border secure, issued coins, and administered the provinces efficiently. He didn't march on Rome or try to conquer the rest of the empire. He just wanted his chunk to function, which it did better than the Central Empire for a while. But competence doesn't prevent assassination. In 269, his own troops killed him during a dispute over whether to sack a city. The soldiers wanted to loot. Postumus said no. The soldiers decided they needed a more flexible emperor. Victorinus succeeded him, and ruled from 269 to 271. He was murdered by one of his officers, supposedly because he'd seduced the officer's wife. Whether that's true or just convenient justification for a power grab doesn't really matter. The Gallic Empire had adopted standard Roman political customs, which included murdering emperors who inconvenienced you. His mother, Victoria, allegedly controlled the succession and managed to place Tetricus I on the throne. Tetricus I ruled from 271 to 274, watching the Gallic Empire slowly collapse under Germanic pressure and internal instability. When Aurelian marched into Gaul in 274 to reunify the empire, Tetricus allegedly negotiated his surrender, possibly even inviting Aurelian to invade so he could escape the job. He was paraded in Aurelian's triumph, but then given a comfortable administrative position in Italy. He survived by surrendering, which was smarter than most imperial exits. The violence of the Gallic emperors followed predictable patterns. They fought Germanic tribes with standard Roman ruthlessness, killing warriors and enslaving or displacing populations. They executed rivals and potential usurpers. They maintained discipline through harsh military punishment. They were, in essence, regular Roman emperors running a smaller empire. The breakaway state wasn't a rejection of Roman methods, just Roman geography. When it ended, the territories were reabsorbed, and everyone moved on to the next crisis. Speaking of crises, let's look at the Eastern equivalent of breakaway ambition: Zenobia and the Palmyrene Dream. The Palmyrene Empire wasn't technically ruled by a Roman emperor, but it occupied Roman territory and challenged Roman authority from 267 to 272, so it deserves mention in our catalogue of imperial violence. Zenobia was the widow of Odenathus, the Palmyrene king who'd been granted Roman titles for defending the eastern frontier. When Odenathus was assassinated in 267, possibly by Zenobia's orders, though sources disagree, she became regent for her young son Vabalithus and immediately started expanding. She was brilliant, ambitious and ruthless in ways that male emperors of her era would recognize. She conquered Egypt, Syria and much of Asia Minor, claiming she was acting on Rome's behalf while building what was clearly an independent empire. She patronized scholars and philosophers, presenting herself as a cultured Hellenistic queen in the tradition of Cleopatra. She also commanded armies that besieged cities, defeated Roman forces, and executed opponents with efficient brutality. Her treatment of captured cities followed Roman military patterns because her armies were essentially Roman-style legions with Palmyrene leadership. Cities that surrendered were incorporated into her empire with relatively light treatment. Cities that resisted faced siege, assault, and the usual consequences of military conquest. When she conquered Alexandria, the city suffered looting and violence before being secured. The Palmyrene expansion was just Roman imperialism with a different capital. Aurelian, after reunifying the Western Empire, marched east in 272 to deal with Zenobia. His campaign showed the systematic brutality he was famous for. He defeated Palmyrene forces in multiple battles, besieged Palmyra itself, and captured Zenobia when she tried to flee. He initially spared the city, leaving a garrison and continuing his campaigns. Then Palmyra rebelled and killed his governor. Aurelian came back, and this time he showed no mercy. The city was sacked, its population massacred or enslaved, and the great desert metropolis was reduced to ruins. It never recovered its former glory. Zenobia was taken to Rome and displayed in Aurelian's triumph, reportedly bound in golden chains because even in defeat she was too impressive to parade in iron. She was allowed to live in comfortable retirement in Italy, dying of natural causes years later. She'd carved out an empire, challenged Rome successfully for 5 years, and survived her defeat. By the standards of failed usurpers, that's a remarkable record. The Eastern Dream died with Palmyra's destruction, but it proved that regional powers could challenge Rome when the empire was distracted. Now let's briefly acknowledge the 30 tyrants. The 30 tyrants. Chaos as a lifestyle. The so-called 30 tyrants weren't actually 30 people, and they weren't all tyrants in the Greek sense of the word. The Historia Augusta, our primary but deeply unreliable source, lists a collection of usurpers, rebels and pretenders who claimed imperial authority during the 3rd century crisis, particularly under Gallienus. The actual number was probably fewer than 30, and many of them were so minor that their historical existence is questionable. But let's talk about the ones who definitely existed and caused real problems. These weren't emperors in any meaningful sense. They were generals, governors, or ambitious officers who saw the empire fragmenting and decided to claim a peace for themselves. They controlled a province, sometimes just a city, declared themselves emperor, issued coins with their faces on them, and ruled until someone with more soldiers showed up and killed them. Most lasted months, some lasted weeks, a few lasted long enough to be remembered individually. Ingenuus rebelled in Musaea in 258, declared himself emperor, and was defeated and killed by Gallienus within months. Gallienus followed immediately after in Pannonia, lasted about as long, and also died violently. Macrianus and Quietus rebelled in the east in 261, divided the eastern provinces between them, and were both dead within a year. Musaeus Aemilianus proclaimed himself emperor in Egypt, ruled the province for about 3 months, and was killed by his own troops when Gallienus's general approached. The violence they caused was less about personal cruelty, and more about the chaos of their rebellions. Civil wars meant armies marching through provinces, requisitioning supplies, fighting battles that destroyed cities and killed civilians. Each usurper raised armies by promising soldiers loot and advancement. Those promises were fulfilled through plunder and confiscation. When they lost, their supporters faced execution or proscription. The cycle repeated with exhausting regularity. Some were barely more than local strongmen. Aurelius controlled northern Italy briefly before being besieged in Milan and killed. Maniacinus rebelled in Gaul and lasted a few months before his own troops murdered him. Domitianus ruled Egypt for possibly days before being overthrown. These weren't grand political movements, they were symptoms of an empire so broken that anyone with a legion could declare themselves emperor, and at least temporarily make it stick. The era of the 30 tyrants demonstrated that imperial authority had become whatever you could enforce with soldiers. There was no legitimacy beyond military strength. The brutality was decentralized, spread across dozens of minor conflicts and rebellions that collectively devastated provinces and killed thousands. Eventually, strong emperors like Aurelian and Diocletian would restore order, but the 3rd century proved how fragile that order was. Now, let's move to the late empire's slow decline. Constantine's sons, dividing the spoils. Constantine the Great died in 337, leaving the empire to his 3 sons, Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans. He'd also left various nephews and half-brothers in administrative positions, creating a complicated family tree of potential rivals. The sons decided to simplify things. In the summer of 337, they orchestrated a purge that killed almost every male relative who might challenge them. Uncles, cousins, nephews, all murdered in a coordinated elimination of dynastic competition. Only 2 young cousins survived, Gallus and Julian, both too young to be immediate threats. It was efficient family planning, Roman style. Start your reign by removing everyone who shares your bloodline and might want your job. The 3 brothers then divided the empire geographically. Constantine II got Gaul, Britain, and Spain. Constantine II took the east. Constans received Italy, Africa, and Illyricum. The arrangement lasted exactly 3 years before Constantine II decided he deserved more. Constantine II invaded Italy in 340 to assert dominance over his younger brother Constan. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Constance's forces ambushed Constantine II near Aquileia, and the eldest brother died in battle or shortly after, his body lost in a river. Constans absorbed his territories and ruled the Western Empire alongside Constantine II in the east. The brothers who'd murdered their extended family together now split the empire between them. We've already discussed Constance's eventual murder by Magnentius in 350 and the civil war that followed. Constantius II spent years fighting Magnentius, eventually defeating him in 353. The civil war devastated Gaul and Italy, with battles killing tens of thousands and leaving provinces economically ruined. When Constantius finally won, he executed Magnentius's supporters systematically, confiscated estates, and purged anyone suspected of having backed the usurper. Constantine's sons brought Christianity to imperial power in ways their father had only started. They closed pagan temples, banned traditional sacrifices, and used imperial authority to enforce Christian orthodoxy. But they also spent their reigns fighting each other and external threats with standard Roman brutality. The religious transformation of the empire didn't reduce violence. It just changed who the targets were. Their legacy was proving that Christian emperors could be as violent, paranoid, and fratricidal as pagan ones. Religion changed the empire's official worship, but it didn't change the fundamental methods of maintaining power. Those remained blood-soaked regardless of which god the emperor claimed to serve. Next, we look at the dynasty that followed and its gradual loss of control. The Valentinian dynasty, fading glory. The Valentinian dynasty ruled from 364 to 392, starting with competent military emperors and ending with children on thrones while Germanic generals ran the empire. Valentinian I, who ruled from 364 to 375, was a capable soldier who divided the empire with his brother Valens, taking the west while Valens held the east. He spent his reign campaigning against Germanic tribes along the Rhine and Danube, winning victories through disciplined military force and systematic fortification building. Valentinian's cruelty was functional rather than sadistic. He maintained harsh military discipline, executed officers who failed, and responded to tribal raids with punitive expeditions that burned villages and killed warriors. He allegedly kept 2 pet bears named Innocents and Mica Aurea that he fed condemned prisoners to, which if true shows a dark sense of humour alongside his military efficiency. He died in 375, reportedly from a stroke brought on by rage during negotiations with Germanic envoys. Dying angry seems appropriate for someone who'd spent his life fighting. His son Gratian ruled the west from 375 to 383, initially showing promise before becoming increasingly ineffective. He was more interested in theological debates and hunting than governing, which left actual administration to subordinates. When Magnus Maximus rebelled in Britain in 383, Gratian's troops abandoned him, and he was captured and executed. He was 24 and had wasted the advantages his father left him. Valentinian II became Western Emperor at age 4 in 375, which tells you everything about the state of imperial authority. He was a puppet for various generals, and his mother never exercising real power. He died in 392 at age 21, either by suicide or murder, depending on which source you trust. The Frankish general Arbogast probably had him killed, then tried to install his own puppet emperor before being defeated by Theodosius I. The Valentinian dynasty showed the empire's trajectory clearly. Strong military emperors like Valentinian I could still defend borders and maintain authority, but their sons lacked the competence or were too young to rule effectively. Power shifted to generals, increasingly Germanic ones, who kept emperors as ceremonial figures while making actual decisions. The brutality continued, but it was generals conducting campaigns and eliminating rivals, not emperors. The office was becoming decorative. Next, the dynasty that consolidated Christianity's dominance while losing military control. The Theodosian dynasty, Christian consolidation. Theodosius I ruled from 379 to 395, 16 years of making Christianity the empire's mandatory religion, while watching military power slip increasingly toward Germanic generals. He was the last emperor to rule both Eastern and Western empires, though calling it rule is generous given how much actual power Germanic officers held. His legacy was religious transformation enforced with imperial law, while the empire's military foundations crumbled beneath theological certainty. He issued edicts in 380 and 391 making Christianity the empire's official religion and outlawing pagan worship. Temples were ordered closed, converted to churches, or demolished. Traditional sacrifices became criminal acts. It was the final step in Christianity's journey from persecuted minority to state-enforced orthodoxy. The transformation took less than a century, and Theodosius completed it with legal authority backed by limited military force. Pagans who resisted faced fines, loss of property, and in some cases violence from Christian mobs that imperial authorities didn't stop. The massacre of Thessaloniki in 390 showed that Christian emperors could match pagan ones for brutality, after rioters in Thessalonica killed a Gothic garrison commander. Theodosius ordered retribution. His troops invited citizens to the hippodrome for games, then locked the gates and slaughtered them. 7,000 people died according to some sources, killed in an enclosed space over several hours. It was calculated massacre as punishment, designed to terrify other cities into obedience. Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan, excommunicated Theodosius for the massacre and forced him to do public penance. The Emperor of Rome stood in church wearing sackcloth, admitting sin, submitting to ecclesiastical authority. It was a remarkable moment showing that Christian bishops could discipline emperors, something unimaginable under pagan rule. Theodosius was readmitted to communion after months, but the precedent was set. Christian emperors answered to church authority in ways previous emperors never had. He divided the empire between his sons when he died in 395. Arcadius got the east, Honorius the west. Both were young, weak and dominated by Germanic generals. Stilicho effectively ruled the west for Honorius. Various officials controlled Arcadius. The emperors were ceremonial, and everyone knew it. The Theodosian dynasty continued through weak sons and grandsons who issued edicts while Germanic kings and generals made actual decisions about military campaigns, border defense, and who lived or died. Christianity was now supreme, but the empire was hollow. Next, let's look at the final Western emperors who watched Rome fall. The final Western emperors, puppets and powerlessness. After 425, the Western Roman Empire entered its final half-century, and the emperors of this period were almost universally children, puppets or placeholders installed by Germanic generals who held real power. The imperial office became a ceremonial position that legitimized whoever controlled the armies. These weren't rulers, they were faces on coins minted by people who actually made decisions. Let's catalogue the futility. Valentinian III ruled from 425 to 455, technically 30 years as emperor, but actually 30 years of his mother Galla Placidia, and various generals controlling things while he existed. The empire lost Africa to the Vandals in 439. Britain was abandoned to Anglo-Saxon invasion. Gaul was divided among Frankish and Visigothic kingdoms. Valentinian's major personal contribution was murdering Astrius, his most competent general, in 454 out of jealousy and paranoia. This removed the last person holding the Western Empire together. Valentinian was himself murdered by Astrius's supporters in 455. He accomplished nothing except hastening collapse. Petronius Maximus ruled for 75 days in 455 before being killed by a mob when Vandals approached Rome to sack it. Avitus ruled for 14 months before being deposed. Majorian we've discussed, the one competent emperor who was murdered for his competence. Lucius Severus was a puppet who ruled 4 years and died conveniently when no longer useful. Anthemius tried to reassert imperial authority and was killed by his own general Ricimer in 472. Aulibrius ruled 4 months. Glycerius ruled a year. Julius Nepos was installed by the Eastern Empire, ruled 2 years in Italy before being driven out, then continued claiming to be emperor from Dalmatia until he was murdered in 480. None of them controlled armies. None made strategic decisions. They were names that Germanic generals used to maintain the fiction of Roman authority while running barbarian kingdoms inside the empire's borders. The brutality of this period was diffuse. Germanic and Roman forces fought each other and barbarian invaders with standard violence. Cities were sacked, populations enslaved or massacred, provinces devastated. But the emperors weren't ordering it. They were watching it happen if they even knew about it, from palaces where Germanic guards kept them alive as long as they remained useful. It was the empire's death as political theatre, with increasingly transparent pretense that Rome still governed Rome. Finally, the last name on the list, appropriate in its irony, Romulus Augustulus, the ironic end. Romulus Augustulus ruled from October 475 to September 476, 11 months that ended with the Western Roman Empire's formal dissolution. His name was perfectly, almost comedically symbolic. Romulus, named after Rome's legendary founder, Augustus, the title of the first emperor, but everyone called him Augustulus, Little Augustus, a diminutive that captured exactly how insignificant he was. He was about 14 years old when his father, Orestes, a Roman general, deposed Emperor Julius Nepos and installed his son as puppet emperor. It was nepotism as final imperial policy. Orestes had been secretary to Attila the Hun before serving various Roman administrations, which tells you how blurred the lines between Roman and barbarian had become. He wanted his son to be emperor, so he made it happen, and nobody with enough power to stop him cared enough to try. Romulus Augustulus was proclaimed emperor, moved into the palace at Ravenna, where the Western court had fled decades earlier when Rome became too dangerous, and proceeded to be utterly irrelevant. He never controlled armies. He never issued meaningful decrees. He was a teenager in imperial robes while his father tried to govern an empire that barely existed. The Germanic foederati, barbarian troops serving under treaty with Rome, demanded land in Italy as payment. Orestes refused. Odoacer, leader of the Heruli and Sciri warriors, decided that if Rome wouldn't give them land, they'd take it. In August 476, Odoacer's forces captured and executed Orestes. Then Odoacer marched on Ravenna. He found Romulus Augustulus in the palace, a frightened teenager whose father had just been killed and whose empire had just ended. Odoacer deposed him on September 476, and then, in an act of surprising mercy, he didn't kill him. Odoacer pensioned the boy off with a generous yearly allowance and sent him to live in a villa in Campania. The last Western Roman emperor retired at age 15 to comfortable obscurity. He disappears from historical records, probably dying quietly decades later, having accidentally witnessed the end of an empire that had lasted 500 years. Odoacer didn't proclaim himself emperor. He declared himself king of Italy and returned the imperial regalia to Constantinople, acknowledging that there was now only one Roman Empire, the Eastern one. The Western Empire ended not with dramatic battle, but with administrative paperwork and a teenage emperor being told to go live in the countryside. Rome fell with a pension and a polite dismissal. History has a sense of irony after all.